Hello, hi. Welcome to our webinar today from Stanford University and from the Stanford Health Communication Initiative. We're very proud to sponsor a live webinar, and we're pleased that you could join us today. We'll begin the program very soon, but I want to just make a few introductory comments. Could we have the next slide, please? So I'm the executive director of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative. We're part of the Center for Health Education at Stanford, part of Stanford Medicine, and we do a series of CME programs on health communication and facilitating improved communication with your colleagues, with the media, and with your patients. Next slide. So the purpose of today's session is to discuss the fundamentals of writing an effective op-ed and a how-to guide. And so while we're preparing for this, if you could please begin to think about an idea that you have for an op-ed, and as soon as you have that, put it in the Q&A so that our panelists can discuss it during the session. This will be a 2.5-hour session that will guide you through the reporting, structuring, and pitching of op-eds for newspapers and magazines. Slide. So the learning objectives are to formulate new ideas for op-eds and research existing publications to prevent duplication, to draft a structure for an effective and compelling op-ed, to appropriately pitch editors using a concise and thorough pitch template, and to develop strategies to effectively work with an editor to revise an op-ed. Slide. So we're recording this webinar, and so it'll be available within a day, and you can share the recording with your colleagues and friends, and of course go back to review it on your own as you wish. Slide. There'll be a course evaluation and certificates for attending the CME so that you can get CME credit. The email address that you use to register will be used to verify your attendance and award the CME. You'll get that link in the evaluation after the event. With the evaluation, you'll be asked to attest to your hours of participation. Please allow 2 to 3 business days for your CME certificate to become available via your Cloud CME account. Slide. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our 2 panelists for today's webinar. First is Rob Steiner. Rob is the director of the Dalai Lama Fellowship in Global Journalism at the University of Toronto. It's the first journalism program designed to specifically teach outstanding specialists how to cover their own disciplines as global reporters. As a Pulitzer Prize-nominated finance journalist, he began his career as a global finance correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. He's the former assistant vice president of the University of Toronto Strategic Communications. Next. And our other outstanding panelist today is Dr. Seema Yasmin. Dr. Yasmin is the director also of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative. She's my partner in the initiative. She's an Emmy Award-winning health and science journalist, and she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Breaking News. Slide. Off. Okay, so it's now time for Rob and Seema to begin the webinar, and we are delighted we have 86 people on the webinar, so we're really pleased that you could join us today and hope you can all stay for the whole webinar.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Hi, Seema.
Hi, Rob. Very excited to be doing this program with you today. Do you want to start off by giving us some background as to your take on op-eds and why you think it's important we're having this discussion today?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, in fact, I should note that Seema was one of the first people through our program after she left the CDC, where she'd been an epidemic and intelligence officer for a while, and came through. So it's really fun, as many of you will know, to actually have a former student as a colleague and peer in teaching. And I learned a great deal from her. So I'm really glad to be able to do this with you. So we teach a program here that is really focused on helping people who are subject matter experts understand how they can communicate with impact into the general public and how they can shape the public debate. And there are two ways to think about this broadly. One is that you can actually participate as a journalist, which is that you actually go out and it's sort of on the model of an Atul Gawande, and you use your opinions in the way that you are thinking about an issue as the prompt, as the beginning of a series of questions that you're curious about, and then you go out and you report it, as Dr. Gawande does for the New Yorker, and then based on what you found, you report back that stuff. That's a lot of work, and it's a lot of fun, but it's not necessarily what everyone does or wants to do or has the time to do. The other way that you can get into it is by taking a perspective that you have developed on something that you know, and I think this is actually quite important, particularly today, because we have all sorts of people who are under the intense pressure of the public discussion, going way beyond their own areas of specialty and starting to venture into things that they know really nothing about, but with the moniker of professor or doctor or something. One of my favorites is a number of people who've done a master's in clinical epidemiology who present themselves these days as infectious disease epidemiologists, which they're not. So importantly, to work on something where you actually do, where your perspective on it is really rooted in your experience. And then to be able to take out of all of those experiences you have and all the things going on in your mind, all the things that you want to say, the one or two items that are actually going to break through and have impact and be meaningful to the layperson who has an interest in this. And there's an art to that, and be able to do it succinctly. And so that's what I think we'll focus on. And if you could do that well, you can really help reshape the public conversation.
Absolutely. And so as Rob and I are talking, we are going to be sharing with you some of the nuts and bolts of reporting, observation, writing, some of the structure and the outline that you'll need, some of the best tips we have about pitching, how to find who to pitch, which are the editors that you might be working with and which outlets. But as we do all of this, we really encourage you to, in the Q&A, just write down in a sentence or two or less, just what idea you have, what brought you to this CME session today, what's really percolating in your mind that you're thinking, look, people either are not reporting about this and people need to be reading op-eds on this topic, or there have been op-eds written, but I have something new to add. So we have one suggestion in the Q&A already, but please add in more, because we really want to make this very hands-on and very useful to you. The way we titled this was intentional, so that you're coming here with an idea, but by the end of it, we really want to help you have an outline and a plan, so you know your next steps for how you're going to structure your piece, how you're going to do a little bit of reporting, how you're going to write it, and then how you're going to pitch it and who you're going to pitch it to. So please, I see the Q&A populating. Thank you. Just keep adding stuff in there. There's no right or wrong here. We're really here to guide you through our experience and our best practices as to how you can be successful in publishing an op-ed. As Rob mentioned, so I'm a hospital doctor and initially an internist in the UK, and then I moved to the US about 10 years ago to do my fellowship in epidemiology. I served as an epidemic intelligence service officer at the CDC, where my job very much was day-to-day epidemic investigations. And it was during my time at CDC that I became very interested in communications and how we were failing communications in public health, and that many on the other side of the fence, the anti-science groups, the anti-vaccine groups, they are so effective at getting their message across, and I think more effective than we are sometimes. And so that's why I kind of took a very interesting turn away from my career. I thought that we'd just, be at CDC or be in a state public health department, and I went on to do Rob's program. As he said, that program takes people who are subject matter experts. So in my cohort, there were another 2 physicians, there was a surgeon, there were lawyers, there were people with PhDs in environmental work. And the program was teaching you, as somebody who already had this expertise, on how to report the news in your field. So it was very heavy on that. And it wasn't really about writing op-eds. But of course, over my career as a journalist over the last 7 years or so, I have written many op-eds, and I think they can be really effective. And now the reason we are doing this CME is because we are desperate for people like you, who are informed, who know things that others don't, who the public don't have that perspective that you do. We need your voice. We need you to be sharing your insights so that we can understand exactly what's happening in your field, or the different angles that are not being explored or shared in the media. And so we're really passionate about empowering you so that you have these amazing ideas, but sometimes, you know, the ways that we've been taught to write articles or to communicate our messages in the lovely world of science, and I'm assuming most folks are science, but it applies even if you're a humanist, in those fields, the ways that we structure and outline and share our messages, they don't work in media. They don't work for a public audience. So there are things that we can borrow, but there are new things that Rob and I want to share. And so some of it will be quite brand new to you. And especially as a scientist myself, I sometimes can get frustrated, like, why isn't there just one way of doing this? For example, the pitching process with editors can be a little bit maddening, but we'll go through all of that. So to get us started, now that you know a little bit about myself and Rob, you know why we're so passionate about this, you know why we're so eager to empower you with the tools to start writing and publishing your op-eds, let's talk a little bit about the fundamentals of this, Rob. So of course we have these ideas percolating, we're desperate to get these ideas out. But what are some of the first things that you would say, Rob, and I'll add in some too, that we need to consider before we put pen to paper?
Yeah, for sure. Do we have the slides, or is
Yeah,
that for me to, can we
I'll
go?
share that.
Okay, so we'll go into that Venn diagram slide for a sec.
Sure.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So there are a couple of different goals, and the way that Seema and I were thinking of doing this is that I would take or a couple of different sort of categories of goals, that I would take the ones on the right hand and pretend to be the editor, and Seema will take the one on the left hand and sort of pretend to be you, and which is, I think, appropriate, because Seema is a lot more like you guys than I am. I'm not a scientist. Although I was grew up surrounded by science. I see that actually one of the ideas here, which we'll get into because I think it's a neat one, is from another diabetologist or endocrinologist in Toronto. And I am still the son of an endocrinologist in Toronto. So that's as close as I get to being a physician and scientist, but I'm much more in the role of the kind of editor. So when I'm sitting at my computer in the morning and you have to sort of bear in mind the editor's perspective. The editor is a little bit like, I would say, is a little bit like an emerge doc, except that things are much less organized and there's no established triage system in a newsroom. And I say an emerge doc because you never know what's coming in. You never know if today's going to be heavy or light, or these days just some variation of heavy. You have no idea what exactly you need and what you're looking for. And chances are you're already involved in 3 or 4 or 5 or 12 different things as new things arise. So you don't have a lot of time to assess ideas. It's not like a peer review in an academic journal. And you're also trying to make decisions very quickly. And so the intuitive questions that an editor will ask, if they even see your pitch, we'll get to that towards the end of this session, is, first of all, this idea, is this different? Is this counterintuitive? Is this surprising? If it's something that is as simple as, and I'll probably keep coming back to, or let me not use COVID because I know we'll get into COVID at some point, that climate change is really bad and climate change is bad for health. We all know that. That's not surprising. But if it's something that is counterintuitive and surprising that I didn't know about, that, say, for instance, lockdowns have made climate change even worse. I'm not saying they have, but if that were something, it immediately piques my interest. So is this idea different, counterintuitive? Does it, as opposed to telling me something I already know? For an op-ed, it's also very important that there be an argument, that you're actually expressing a perspective. And I hear that we're pitching every week. We pitch our partners. We pitched a very interesting idea to the Boston Globe Ideas section last week. It was perfect for the Boston Globe. It was about the COVID-related situations in Massachusetts prisons. And they turned it down because it didn't have an argument. So we're going back to try to figure out an argument to put in there. I'll skip one of these. Is the argument actually substantive? Is it just you sort of flailing from the sidelines, or do you have some meat, some facts, some data that will back it up? So here it's important, actually, even though you're not reporting this as a journalist, it's important nonetheless to be skeptical about your own ideas, to ask yourself, really kick the tires on your own predilections and ask yourself, are there data that back these up? Can I demonstrate this to my skeptical, imagine you're aunt or uncle at Diwali at the party or at Thanksgiving or whatever it may be, would I be able to convince her or him of this thing if they're skeptical usually about my ideas? So you have to have some real substance, and you may need to call a few folks actually to figure that out, or do a little bit more broader reading. Last couple of things that an editor will intuitively ask: is this point that she or he is making, right? This idea, it's different, it's interesting, it's counterintuitive, I've never heard it before. There's a clear argument that's backed up by interesting facts. But is this actually relevant and important to my readers? My readers only have time to read one thing a day, let's say. We're not taking the subway these days by and large, but if you can imagine, you're at home, you have a few minutes before your kids come down and have to get online for school, and I'm the reader of, say, the Dallas Morning News, the opinion section. I know my kids are going to be tumbling down the stairs in 5 minutes, and I will need to set them up so they can get on their math class. Is this the one thing I'm going to read today? Is this opinion actually really relevant to them? And that'll vary depending on the different readers. So you have to be thinking, when you think of an op-ed, and we'll talk about this later, what kinds of readers, what audience you want to get to. And the final criterion that I have as an editor is, are you, so now you've cleared all these hurdles, right? It's an interesting idea. It's backed up by some interesting facts. So I can see it's substantive. There's actually an argument here. It is really relevant. And then my last question, or it's baked into all of this, is if this were such an interesting idea, why haven't I heard this before? Who is this person to come and tell me? And if I look down and I see, so-and-so who's writing about cancer is a massage therapist, I'm like, oh, okay, well, she's not really credible to be giving me that advice. But if I look down and I see so-and-so who's writing about cancer is a pediatric oncologist, it's like, oh, okay, she's good on this. I can actually, or if she's pitching me a story on massage, but she's a pediatric oncologist, I'll want to know, why is she the person pitching me a story on massage? So you have to be credible on this, which gets back to, and I won't name names, not standing up on a podium to, go way beyond your field and start to prognosticate or pontificate about things. So those are the things that the editor will ask, and they're like neurological reflexes. The editor will just be thinking, bang, bang, bang. All these questions will come out at the same time, and within a couple of minutes, they'll make a decision, or even less. Do I want to go forward with this or not?
Great. And we started with Rob intentionally because we want to, before we start anything, be thinking about the editor and be thinking about what they're looking for, what their mindset is. One thing to emphasize is that although this is an op-ed and it's not your regular reported kind of journalistic story, there is an element of reporting involved, as Rob mentioned, and that's 2 levels. One is just doing a lot of reading. If you're going to be writing, you need to be reading a lot more than you are writing. It's like carb loading for a marathon. You just need to be consuming a lot of what's out there. And that's to make sure that you're not pitching ideas that are already there. And also so that you know the kind of idea you have, the way that you want to write it, fits with a particular outlet. There are differences between different outlets. We're going to get more into this, but you want to start thinking about this early on, because audience is everything. Before you start putting your words down, before you even start writing an outline, you want to be thinking, what's the point of this? Am I trying to inform policymakers and influence policy? Am I trying to, which target audience am I really trying to reach here? You want to think about, like I mentioned, therefore, what's the right outlet? And then you want to be doing your deep reading of that outlet to make sure you're not just reiterating things that the editor's already seen. And with the reporting, that does involve the broad reading that I mentioned, but also picking up the phone and doing some research, calling people. If you've read a study that this might be based on that isn't your study, then calling the lead author. That doesn't mean that quotes from them will end up in your op-ed. They could, and that's fine, but you definitely need that background information that will come from some level of reporting. And I will say, because we're really thinking about the relationship we're going to have with the editor, the back and forth, Rob talked about those kind of neurological reflexes and editors making these decisions quickly. That does happen. And then there's a lot of slowness involved as well. So you're pitching, you're desperate to get a response back, because the best practice that I teach in my journalism classes is if you've pitched a story to one editor at one outlet, you can't pitch to others until you've heard from them. That can be tricky. Not everyone abides by that. It's a thing that I follow and a practice that I believe is the best way to do this, so that you don't end up in a muddle with 2 or 3 editors wanting your story. So that's another thing to bear in mind, that when one way to maneuver around that is to say, there's a news hook to this, it's very timely, I need a response by the end of tomorrow. And by that point, I'll have moved on. Not every story warrants that. Not every story is breaking news related. The reason I mentioned about the slowness and the quickness of editors is they may make those decisions quickly, and then you may end up with, great, they're going to run your piece. And we'll talk more about how op-eds are written on spec, not pitched in the same way that a reported story is pitched. But then there can be a lot of slowness where you're not hearing back, you're not seeing the edits. And so that's something that we'll get into as well. The final point I'll mention is this point about getting paid. It's a tricky one. I teach journalism here at Stanford. This is the question I get asked all the time by my students. There are journalism professors out there who are like, writing is such an incredible craft, it's so difficult, everyone should get paid all the time for it. And there are others who are like, no, you should write for free at the beginning, just get your clips out there. Because we all come from different circumstances and we don't all share the same privileges, I don't have a hard and fast rule on that, but you may. And so it's important for you to know, and I want you to know, that some outlets like the New York Times typically pay around $250 to $500 for an op-ed, whereas some outlets like Scientific American and Medscape can pay more than $1,000 sometimes. So if that's important to you, that's something to bear in mind. That's very much related to the kind of outlet you might pitch to. And it's interesting, I think, that oftentimes the higher payments for op-eds or for reported pieces, those higher payments come from more niche outlets. They might be the ones that you think, well, fewer people read this compared to the New York Times or the Washington Post. However, you might get paid more for having your story published there. But more importantly, perhaps for you, you make that assessment, you might be reaching a particular audience that's very important for you to communicate your message with. So everything comes back to audience. And it's one of the first things that you want to think about, along with which editor am I pitching to? What are their criteria going to be? What are they looking for? Boom, 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 in my email and in my piece. And therefore, which is the right outlet for me to pitch to? So we're going to move on to that a bit more now. Rob?
Can I just want to add a couple of quick things to this from this slide. So in my experience, a lot of op-eds simply aren't paid, right? The outlet itself decides, we're giving you the vehicle to put your opinion out there. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to. This is actually where you're not being paid, because this is a facility that we make available to the public. But there's a range now. Now that more and more that the line that used to exist, and it used to be a very solid line. When I was in the newsroom, there was a very solid line between opinion and news writing. And news writing was very much a sort of voice from nowhere, which we've now realized is actually, there is no voice from nowhere. It's usually, what that usually means is it's a white male voice that can dissociate itself from most things that don't have to do with white males. So as we recognize that in a very progressive and I think smart way in journalism, the lines around what is opinion and what is news reporting are really blurred. So sometimes you'll be pitching into a publication and into a space within that publication that is thinking of you as, someone will be writing an article and you should be paid. Sometimes you'll be pitching into a publication that is making its soapbox available to the public and they're providing you an asset. And they just don't pay for it. So be aware and ask if things are paid. If they're interested in your story, ask if it's paid, but be aware of the kinds of rules that they're likely to have in different places. The important point from all of this, I think, is know why you're pitching to a place. Everyone wants to get into the New York Times, the Atlantic. If you're in the UK, everyone wants to get into the Guardian. If you're in Canada, everyone wants to get into the Globe and Mail. And in India, it's the Times of India. You'll have your equivalents. But that's not always the best place to be. Things get lost in massive places. The New York Times publishes literally hundreds of items every day, and is seen in some circles as highly partisan. And so it may not be the right place. It may be much better to pitch a story to the British Medical Journal, or in Canada to the Canadian Medical Association Journal, or to some place or Scientific American. So be strategic. What do you want out of that article? What do you want it to achieve?
Absolutely. That's a great point. Rob, let's talk about the fact that once you have picked an outlet, and please ask us questions in the Q&A if you're now thinking, well, I have this idea, how do I exactly figure that out? But it's a different pitching process because you write it on spec. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because it's normally that's the thing that you say don't do if you're pitching a regular reported story.
Yeah. So my bread and butter is really teaching people how to be reporters. And when you're a reporter, and if you're interested in that kind of thing, and I should be clear on the difference. The difference is that if you are a reporter, you're in effect starting with a question, going out and finding what the answer may be, and with a very open mind. You are not beholden to your own thinking. You are reporting it. There's a lot of reporting work that goes into it. And in that kind of work, and if you will, that's a kind of stuff that sort of proverbially appears on the front page, not in the opinion section and so on. If you're doing, and those are things where we also don't really care necessarily who wrote the thing, because it's the facts that are interesting.
Right.
If you're doing that kind of work, then the rule is to pitch an idea first, to do a little bit of reporting first until you know, basically, until you can answer those same questions on the right side of the slide. They're the same kinds of questions, but that you know that you're pursuing that project in a way that is of interest to the outlet. They can offer you some direction if they're interested in it. You have a lot of work to do. So that's why I really urge people, if they're doing reporting, to pitch first and make sure that someone is interested, and to understand why they're interested and what they're interested in specifically before going on and continuing to do all the reporting, potentially down the wrong path. Opinion stuff is different, though. For an opinion, typically, it's not always, there are no hard and fast rules in journalism, but the standard pretty much is that they actually want to see your argument. They want to see you articulate the argument. They want to see the whole thing before you actually before they decide whether to take it or not. So for these, you actually want to write the argument first. You want to write the piece, which means understanding, before you even send the email, understanding something about the outlet. What length do they typically write to? So actually, you can cut and paste an article off the website, put it into your Word doc, put it into a Word document, and see the number of words it actually is. If they typically run an op-ed at 1,000 words, do not send them 3,000 and don't send them 200. It'll give you a sense of the questions they're asking, what's relevant for their audience. It'll give you a sense of whether this stuff is really personal, or if it gets from the personal into the data-driven very quickly. So you want to research that, craft that first, and then submit it. And we'll talk about structure in a second. I don't know if we're going there.
Yeah, we're ready for that. But so I just want to kind of summarize this, because you've had an idea. You're like, look, no one is talking about this, or people are, but they're missing this key thing. I am the right person to give you an opinion piece to inform you on this topic. And now you're thinking, okay, that's not enough. I also need to know, who am I writing this for? Who's my audience? Based on that, which is the right outlet? Which outlet is reaching that audience? Then you're thinking about the editor at that particular outlet, or maybe you've narrowed it down to 3 or 4. What will that editor be looking for? What's already been published? What's already out there broadly? And what's already in this particular outlet? What have they covered on this or not? So you're thinking about all of that, especially you may also be thinking about the payment part. That is important to me. I don't write for free. It's just a rule that I have, because partly I make some of my living off of being a journalist as well. But that's just a thing that I think we need to talk more about, money in journalism. And that's why I bring it up. I think too often it's just a point that's really dismissed. And for some people, it's really important. For others, it's like, no, it's fine. I do find the fact that with a reported piece, you send a pitch that's just outlining what you're going to report on. Whereas with the op-ed, you write on spec, right? And I find that frustrating, because I came up through the journalism program that Rob teaches, which is so much about not writing on spec. And so now when I do write op-eds, I'm like, oh, it's a time investment. I'm writing 800, 1,500 words that may eventually not get picked up, because sometimes that just may not happen given the timing and things like that. So now that we've got you up to speed on that, we are going to do a Q&A in half an hour. But for the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk more about the reporting and writing process, and the really important part, which is how do you structure this in a way that will work for a lay audience or for your target audience, a way that is not academic, because this is really for a journalistic outlet.
I just want to, there was one question there that I think is actually really timely for what we're talking about right here, Seema, and it's from Anonymous. So wherever you are, Dr. Ms., Mr. Anonymous, you asked a great question, which is I don't have an idea right now, but how do I know if an idea is
I
worth
saw that too. I thought that was a really great question.
Yeah, and I would, so one thing is you can take these criteria on the right side of this Venn diagram and throw your idea up against that. And
Yeah.
if there are more to which it's answering yes than no, then you probably have something. But there's one criterion in here that I didn't make explicit, not for any reason. I was just sort of jamming this slide out, and I suppose I forgot to put it in, but it's implicit in the is this very important for my readers? And that's timing. So we should just mention this
Oh yeah.
quite
Yeah.
quickly. There is something in journalism that we call a hook, something that needs to be relevant now. Now, not everything has to be relevant now. There's some really interesting science stories about the latest discovery of, of some kind of, fungus that is just weird and interesting, and there will never be a good time for it or a bad time. It's just an interesting story. But most often, editors want to know that I should be reading this right now because this taps into something we're all talking about around the kitchen table. We're all talking about this. And so if you're seeing the conversation go off the rails, or if you're seeing the conversation go in a direction that you think is not helpful or is missing something, and it's a rather urgent conversation that's happening now, that's a good time. You'll get maybe, as we used to say about the Spider-Man movies, a bit of a spidey sense, a bit of a tinkling like, damn, these people need to know this now. This is important now. Make that explicit when you, in the story, and we'll talk about the structure now, actually, a good segue. But that should also tell you, that there's that it's worth pitching something or writing something up.
Yeah, so that's another thing that the editor will be thinking about is, why are you the right person to write this? Why is their outlet the right place to publish this? And why now? And that's something we'll talk about in the pitch email part as well. Thanks for flagging that, Rob, because it was a question that I was like, I wish I knew who asked it, because it's such a great point.
Yeah. Do you want me to jump into this one?
Yeah, sure. And then I'll jump in. Can you turn the notifications off on your computer, please?
Oh yeah, sorry. That's
Which keep pinging. So I'll just get us started on this, because for many of us, we didn't come up through journalism, right? We went to school for science or engineering or for the humanities. And so appropriately so, within those disciplines, we learned ways to structure our arguments that fit for that discipline. There are norms within each of them. And we're not saying that any one of these is right or wrong or better than the other. I mean, I actually do think the journalistic way is just actually more narratively compelling and more human, and just like a more straightforward storytelling structure. But what we are asking you to do is to make that distinction between the way that you might write for the New England Journal or for the the Journal of the American Cancer Society, for example, versus how you're going to write this op-ed. So Rob, I'll let you say more about those structures.
Awesome. I hope I turn off I always fiddle with this. So if my notifications are not off, my apologies. I will not allow myself to be distracted by it. Let me go back to, sorry, just a moment. Thank you. Yeah, so this is a slide that I put together a few years ago. I was invited to teach this stuff to a bunch of Rhodes Scholars who were at Oxford, and I had in the room a combination of people doing their sort of doctorates and masters in humanities and the sciences and the social sciences right across the piece. And they were also, because this is the nature of the Rhodes Scholarship, very engaged people. So they were very much in a role like all of you. And it struck me, having spent a long time reading the academic literatures in different fields. My own background is in the humanities, but then I went to business school, so I became exposed to the literature in the social sciences. And now I'm very exposed to the literature and the sciences, that there are obviously very formal structures in these literatures. They're changing now, I recognize that, but there are some formal structures in these literatures that exist for particular reasons. We'll focus on the science and social science structure rather than the humanities one, because I took a quick look at the disciplines from which people are coming, and I think that's the most relevant. And the reason I'm putting this up is because I want to map on to that traditional structure, the very different structure of journalism, that journalism has in order to achieve a different goal. So as you all know, the science structure for, say, a journal article usually starts with a question. We're below the abstract, usually starts with a question. Here's what we're actually going to be exploring. It's quite precise. You then, I'm sorry, you heard that, my apologies. There's a lit review. There's a bit of academic background of who the investigators are, what their center is, but there's often a lit review. And then there's a long section about method. Because this has to be replicable, it has to be transparent, it has to be reviewable by the peers. We actually have to understand the limits on the data that we generate through all this. So it's very important to have long transparency on the method. And then, of course, we have the data. And then after all of that, we get to the conclusion. And the conclusion, by definition, is very limited. We are not expanding in the conclusion beyond the specific data that we generated in the context of the method that we had addressing the specific question that we proposed, period. We don't extrapolate. The final part, though, which I think is sometimes, I would imagine, not having written in the science or social science literature myself, I would imagine is sort of the most fun part to write, is the areas for further study. But that might also be in a bit of a discussion. My guess is, and I've sort of having sat next to my dad for 2 decades, because I used to do my homework in his study as he would write his papers. I think that my guess is that this is also an area that's rather fraught for discussion if there's multiple authors, and it's just sort of, it's the part that's the most tentative, the least linked to the data, and so it's the part which is sort of fun to think about maybe, but also the part where we feel a little bit on thin ice, right? Journalism reverses this, same pieces, different order, more or less. We take the areas for further study, if you will, we take that part of the conversation, actually, I won't say it that way. We take the bottom line, we take the thesis, we take what we've seen, and we put that right up top. We don't back into it through the question and the methods and the research, and so on. We take that, we have to understand that even if, and I'll use the example of the person sitting in, let's say, in Omaha, whose kids are running downstairs getting ready for their math class, that she not only, okay, so yes, she's decided to read this, but actually, in the article is 1,000 words, so it should only take her 5 minutes to read, but she doesn't have 5 minutes because her 9-year-old has just barreled down the stairs and needs breakfast. She has basically a minute and a half. So if she's stuck after a minute and a half, only having read the question, and here's how we went about the answer and back into it, she has no idea what we're talking about. And that's how most of us read our media, right? Or we're in line at the grocery store and reading it on our phones. So you get to the punchline off the top, right? And the punchline, the bottom line, if you will, which goes right up at the top, also has to be blunt. That doesn't mean it's dumbed down, and that doesn't mean that it exaggerates or extrapolates beyond what the evidence will show. But it means that we are a little bold in saying what we mean to say. One way to think about this is to think about how we speak versus how we write. So English, is basically 2 languages baked into one. It's this sort of Germanic language that the peasants in England spoke in the fields before the Norman conquest, and everything is direct, and then it's this romantic Latinate language that the Normans spoke when they arrived and went into the castles, and everything is a long Latinate romance word with some passive sentences, and we get lost. That's how we're comfortable writing, but that's not how we speak. So write like you speak, be direct and blunt and straight about what you mean, and put that up at the top. Having put that up at the top, you then need to explain, and by the top, I mean maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs. This is what this is about. This is the thing I want you to know, period. Having put that up at the top, you then need to go in and say, here's why it's important for you to know this. Here's the broader picture. This thing, and I'll just use some examples here. This thing about removing, Jane St. Clair has an example here, why menthol flavorings should be removed from retail sales. This thing, so the idea is why menthol cigarettes and menthol flavorings should be removed from the retail sales market in my state, right? Clearly talking about cigarettes. So I don't smoke, my kids don't smoke. It doesn't seem relevant to me. You could put that line that Jane wrote up in the lead, something along those lines. That's a good, powerful lead. We'll talk about how you should pitch declarative sentences rather than questions, but let's say menthol cigarettes, menthol flavoring need to be removed now in my state, right? And here's why it's now, here's why it's timely now. And then that next part, the stakes for the audience, is a part that says, excuse me for the background noise, the part for the audience that says, even if you don't smoke cigarettes, this is what's really at stake. What's really at stake is whether the state can actually warn us about health issues. What's really at stake is something much broader. What's really at stake is something that everyone should actually be thinking about, right? So that's what we call the nut graph. And this far down to the, those two paragraphs, that's all that most people will actually read, okay? But we have another 600 words or so. So then we get into, for the folks who want to read it, that last 10 or 15% of folks who actually do want to read and will continue to read, and whose kids have not yet tumbled down for the math class online, and you don't have to start making their smoothie, which is going on in my kitchen right now. You put a couple of paragraphs of background. That's sort of our equivalent of the lit review. But the lit review in the academic literature is pretty extensive. In the humanities literature, it can be most of the paper. In the science literature, it's maybe a page packed with citations and so on. This is just, here's how we got here. On the cigarette example, 20 years ago, people started marching on the State House demanding for this, and the cigarette industry pushed back, and then we forgot about it. But in the last 3 years, it's become a crisis again. Bang, right? That's the background. And then the rest of it, frankly, is just the same thing that you learned to do when you wrote a high school essay. Argument 1, argument 2, argument 3. The only thing that I like to throw in here, and my son reminded me of it when he was doing his IB program in high school, is a little paragraph of counter argument, just to show you understand you're not the only perspective out here. At the Wall Street Journal, we used to call that the to be sure argument. To be sure, simply putting menthol, or simply removing menthol cigarettes, from stores is not going to be the solution to smoking. To be sure, removing this stuff may create other problems like blah, 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 blah. Or to be sure, states that have tried this have had other problems that they've created, blah, 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 blah. But then we get to argument 3. But the critical piece of this is the first 3 boxes. Be blunt with your bottom line. Tell us why we should care, even if it's not directly related to me. The stakes here are larger than you may think. If you want to think back, if you're American, you want to think back to the impeachment trial. That was one of the most powerful things. I was knocked over with the flu that week, and so I was watching it. And when the impeachment trial started, in the first part of the speech from the congressman from California, whose name I forget, who was presenting the case, was saying, this is not about the Ukraine. And this is not about a bunch of emails that went back and forth. And this is not about Rudy Giuliani in Kiev. This is about bang, 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 bang. So even if you don't care about that stuff, this is the bigger point. That's really key. And then a little bit of background and then into the thing. Okay, that was a long ramble. I hope that's helpful.
No, that was good.
Thank you. Yes, my hero.
Sometimes you need a long ramble to kind of like take you through it. So I just want to go over a couple of points. First off, the reason that the lead needs to hook your reader isn't just because they might be a busy parent, right? And they only have a couple of minutes. It's also because many things are competing for their attention. So even if they have time, they're the kind of person that has a media diet, and they've said every morning for 30 minutes, I'm going to read something. You need to catch them in that first paragraph, in those first few sentences. That's your most precious real estate, so that they're like, yeah, I'm going to stick with this. So in your lead, you're saying, oh my gosh, this is so interesting and so important. And then in the second graph, you're immediately saying, and this is why you need to keep reading. This is why you should care. When Rob talks about the counter argument, I actually think it's useful to do that for each of your arguments. So argument 1, then the counter, argument 2, then the counter. And I don't like the to be sure, because I just think that's a weird way to start a sentence. And I see it all the time in op-eds, because clearly that's the way like a lot of organizations and programs teach with an op-ed, like, oh, you need to have that paragraph that's like, you're full of your caveats and to be sure. I just think actually it's more seamless to say, here's an argument, here's what I'm proposing. Some people say that might not work because here's another argument, here's the counter argument. Then you get to your kicker, which is your final paragraph of your opinion piece. This is a thing that I used to struggle with when I was first in a newsroom as a staff writer, because I used to try and do 2 things. One is I would do the kind of sciencey thing, which is like, we need more research. There are still so many unknowns. Or the other thing that I would do is try and wrap everything up into a very nice package. And my editor, my first newspaper editor, was like, why are you doing that when the world is really messy? It's okay to leave some things unanswered. It's okay for this to not be complete at the end, because this is the real world. Things are messy. And the other thing is, don't say that we need more research. That's the way that we end our scientific papers. It doesn't work so well in the journalistic style. I'll also add that, we talk about these structures, like what you see in the humanities, what you see in the social sciences versus what you see in journalism. I see things shifting a little bit in some of the scientific journals. I've seen some slight revamps where they haven't completely obviously gone away with the archaic way of structuring an academic paper, but some of them have now introduced boxes up top, which kind of get to the lead, like what's happening here, what does this add to the literature? And that can be a really useful summary. So I even see like some of the more old school journals are noticing that the ways we've been doing things just because that's the way you do it, they're actually not the most effective way of communicating an argument. They're not the best ways of really grabbing someone's attention in a world where we're all multitasking and trying to do so many different things at the same time. The final thing I'll add before we give you a tiny assignment is that we shared this structure with you, but even within the world of journalism, you'll see some variation in some outlets. I think it still pretty much sticks to this, but there are style things to be aware of. The New Yorker, those pieces are different to what you see in the New York Times, to what you see in the Dallas Morning News. So this comes back to that first point we made with our first slide: know your audience, therefore know which outlet you want to be published in, therefore do your research. What do the published pieces in that outlet look like? Make sure you're pitching something that fits, that's going to be a good fit for outlet, and not something that's going to read as if it's very, very different. Rob, anything else to add? Otherwise, I'll set folks up for the little assignment we have.
Yeah, no, I just, as I was saying that, and I'm looking through, these are great ideas, by the way. I'm looking through them, and what a neat variety. We're not going to get to every one of them, by the way, but there's some consistent themes in a number of them. And one of them, and I'll just throw it in here and we'll come back to it, is focus. One thing that I see, and I see it a lot when we teach, I see it when I edit, and I see it in some of these ideas, is wanting to write about a topic, wanting to write about, say, women's empowerment in health, or wanting to write about
very common,
right, a very broad kind of topic. This stuff, you need to focus on one dimension, peel it off piece by piece by piece. So some of these we'll talk about them later. I don't want to get ahead of us of ourselves, but
Rob, can I just add, like, this is really, really common. So like in your first newspaper job, or when people first start writing, they'll go to an editor and say, I want to do a story. And the editor's like, what's the story? And you're like, homelessness. And they're like, that's the topic. What's the story? So this, if you're there and you're proposing broad ideas, that's completely fine and normal, but we're here to kind of help you hone that. Sorry, go on, Rob.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say exactly that, right? So, the editor would say, homelessness, that's a topic. What do you want to do? Well, homelessness in Toronto now. Okay, let's try to shave this in. And where we get to at the end of the day is the fact that cops are kicking people out right now from homeless encampments. There's something very specific, and that people have brought a complaint against the police about their aggressive behavior in tent encampments in Toronto. Very specific one topic. So that's how specific you need to be, and you don't have to worry about trying to reinvent or like to present the entire history of an entire topic on one story. Every story is just one piece.
Absolutely. And one of the ways that I get my journalism students to think about this early on, and I'm sure they don't like it because it's a bit of a challenge, and I find it challenging too, is you have your idea. It's still percolating. It's not fully fledged yet. And at that point, I still say to my journalism students, okay, what would be a headline for your story? And they're like, but I don't even like, and I'm like, no, just think about it. It's early. We're not saying this is going to be your headline, but what might be the headline for this story? Because that's a really good way of just getting you to focus on, okay, in a nutshell, what is this story about? And so even though it's hard and I don't like doing it for myself, it's good because otherwise our brains can like take us out here and we're thinking of all the things to do with homelessness. And then you're like, no, the headline for this, what I'm really getting at is that mental illness is correlated with homelessness. And I want to write about these new studies that show that actually just housing people, not even giving them actually psychological care, but just housing people who are homeless improves mental health. And so just think about that early on. It's challenging, so you may not want to do it. And I think my journalism students try and skip it too, but think about what might be an early headline for your story. Again, not the one you're going to stick with. It's okay, write a couple, but it's a good way of just getting you to narrow down on what you're really writing about. What's the story versus what's the huge issue.
Great.
Anything to add, Rob?
I think that's it. So you wanted to go to a sorry,
Yeah.
I see I'm taking a bunch of questions. Why don't we go to the assignment, and I'm taking I'm keeping a track. We have 4 really good questions and a bunch of good ideas that we can get into later.
Awesome. So we're going to give you about 9 minutes now. We want you to come back at 11 a.m. Pacific, so in 9 minutes. And at that time, we're going to have a 15-minute Q&A, so we'll get to some of the things that you've been raising. But for the next 8 to 9 minutes, we want you to do some research on your own, because we really want you to leave the session with knowing what the next steps are. So for the next 8 minutes, we want you to go away, Google your idea, and think about Googling the potential outlets where this might fit, given you now have this criteria for thinking about what the editor's looking for, what your goals are, the idea that's kind of marinating in your mind. Based on that, go away and think about what the potential outlets might be, who your target audience is, and even start thinking, we don't have much time, but just start thinking about what the structure might be as well. So we'll meet back here at 11 a.m. Pacific, which is in 8 minutes time, and then we'll get to your Q&A for 15 minutes.
I'll be looking through all this stuff. I'm going to turn my my mic and my camera off, but I'm here if anyone wants to.
Okay, we'll give you 1 minute to wrap up whatever you're working on now. I'll give you 1 more minute. I know some folks are still wrapping up. Okay, thank you so much for doing that. We hope it gave you a few minutes out of your very busy day to just think about the next steps about this op-ed, where it might land. Maybe the Googling and the doing a little bit of reading and research helped you rule out a couple of outlets. Maybe they've already covered this topic or they haven't and therefore don't seem interested, or you're thinking more specifically about who your target audience is, what your specific goals are for this op-ed. But I want to introduce another idea because I was really clear that, a rookie thing to do as a writer is to go to your editor and say, I want to write about homelessness. And your editor's like, that's a subject, that's not a story. And so we're trying to get you to hone in on what's your story about, what's your idea. However, once you have focused in on that one story, that one idea, that one angle can lead to multiple stories. So let me be clear. When I'm saying that you're writing an op-ed on spec, you've got it down, you've looked at the structure we've outlined, you're thinking about audience, you're thinking about the outlet. Once that exists as a document, I think the best practice is to send that to one editor at a time, right? So that's one story. However, a thing that Rob is really good at, not saying it's the only thing he's good at, but he's good at many things, but a thing that Rob is really skilled at is taking an idea you have and helping you think about, well, actually, that could work as a slightly different story for multiple outlets in a way that the stories don't compete with one another. So Rob, can you tell us more about that? Because that's something that I learned from you, that especially as someone who now freelances, it's so valuable because literally you generate more exposure, more income from a starting off point that seems like one idea. You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll put a quick caveat on this, which is we're not talking about sending the same story to many places at the same time. That's really important. Even if the same story pops up, say, in South Africa and in California, all it takes is a Google search on a keyword or on your name, and an editor will see
two of the identical stories that have popped up in different places without them knowing. That is not what we're talking about.
Right.
But what we are talking about is the idea that if you have a particular insight, so I'll just go in here, take an example about people think obesity. This is from Dharani Swarna Devigan. I hope that I pronounced your name right. My apologies if I did not. People think that obesity means looking fat. I want to create awareness about visceral obesity that has a deleterious effect on health, but often goes unnoticed. So I'm not sure what visceral obesity means, but let's say we're talking
around the organs.
Oh, that like literal visceral obesity. Okay, so obesity that is not that's not apparent from the outside. Okay, got it. Yeah, highly relevant. Obviously, what one could imagine, and one could see that playing out in a couple of different places. First of all, you might put that into some kind of mainstream publication. So let's say if you're writing from California, you might pitch it to something that a lot of people in California would read, in San Francisco or in LA, something that's mainstream. You might know that there's a particular population group that is particularly vulnerable to this. I don't know if that might be younger people or older people or retired. Let's say younger people. I'm making this up. I don't know. And there are some specific outlets that target younger people. If it's younger women, then there might be some magazines, outlets, websites that target them. And you would write it in a different way, targeting them. It might be, for them, it might be 5 tips or 5 things to watch out for, 5 reasons to call your doctor, right? You might also write this in a very different way for a publication that's geared towards GPs who may not be thinking about this when they're doing a quick checkup or physical or assessing someone. They might have learned about it years ago, but it's in the back of their mind, and so you want to refresh them. So that's not necessarily a journal article. That might be something that is that's in a professional publication that GPs are reading. So there are different ways to think about this. So you take one insight, one set of facts, you understand how different audiences are interested in it. You propose it to different places, letting each one know that there's, this is a bit of an art, and Seema may have some thoughts on this. I think best practice is when one place picks it up, say, just FYI, I'm pitching something totally different on this topic to a non-competing outlet, but I just want you to know, you may or may not feel that you need to do that. It depends on how close the two are. But the core idea here is that you want to think of how the same insight will play out in different ways to different audiences and write different things for those audiences and get it out to 2 or 3 places. Another way to think about this, by the way, is to think geographically. So this may not be an example on that, but you might think of an issue, maybe it's a public health issue or an issue about vaccine distribution or something, and you can pitch one version to an American publication where the question is, why should we care in the United States? We paid for these things. Why should we care if anyone in Kenya gets it, right? And you're writing to that audience. You might write, based on the same insights, a totally different piece to the Standard in Kenya, where the question is, how does Kenya make sure, here's a view from inside the United States, how does Kenya make sure it gets some of this? And then you might write a totally different piece again to a scientific publication where you can approach it from a scientific basis. So it just gives you an idea of how you can get more hits than just one off the same place. But the key is that you're not pitching to 2 places that are competitive, and that you're not sending the same article to all those places.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So having said that, shall we look at some of the questions, Rob?
Yeah.
Do you want to maybe start off with one and we can both answer it?
Yeah, so I've taken them down in shorthand, so I don't have to scroll back. So you'll forgive me if and I'm not reading the names, but how much do you actually charge? How do you know how much to charge for something? Seema's been in the market more recently than me, so.
Yeah, great question. There's this essay on Medium that's quite a depressing essay where this guy has really carefully researched how much writers used to get paid per word in the 80s and how much we get paid now. And you kind of sadly see like the devaluing of the written word. It feels like it's a really variable marketplace. As I said, some outlets don't pay anything because they know they'll still get people to publish. And some folks get really annoyed at that. They're like, if you keep publishing for free, then the rest of us, I get it, but I also understand that some folks just need to get stuff out there. So that's why I don't have that like hard and fast rule for my journalism students either. I gave you a bit of a range earlier on, that some of the bigger outlets like New York Times pay roughly $250 for an opinion piece. And then there are others like Medscape and Scientific American that can sometimes pay upwards of $750 to 1,000 words for an op-ed. Sometimes a little bit more. It depends on how you negotiate. Like everything is up for negotiation, to be honest. So it really depends on the outlet. It depends on what you are willing to do, but there's massive variety. I can't unfortunately say to you, oh, the going rate is $2.50 a word. I wish. It's like either 0 cents a word, or it can be $3 a word, depending on like how much you've written before, your relationships with editors, and which outlet you are pitching to.
So there's an interesting corollary, or because we're speaking to Americans, corollary. I always find it interesting that Americans and Canadians say this differently. There's an interesting corollary or corollary to this, which is that often, Seema gave the example of Scientific American, which will pay a lot more than the New York Times. Why is that? The most radical example that I've seen of it was in our first year. We had an environmental lawyer, highly qualified. She'd worked in our program the year before Seema was in it. Worked before coming to our program as a lawyer for the Library of Parliament here, which is like working as a staff lawyer for a congressional committee in the States. And she was writing really important stuff, but she also happened to be on those topics, but she also happened to be a mountain biker and one of the top mountain bikers in Canada, which I did not know when we admitted her to the program. It was just very neat. And she, along the way, decided to pitch a story about a whole bunch of new mountain biking parks around Toronto to a mountain biking magazine that I'd never heard of because I'm not a mountain biker. She got more than $1,000 for that, right? And this is a small magazine. So why does that exist? The Times, you know, has so much money. Why aren't they paying $1,000 per thing? And it is straightforward economics, microeconomics, right? Big publications know that that everyone wants to be there. Everyone wants to be there. And so, you know, they can charge, they can pay what they want and they'll still get a lot of folks in there. They also know that there are a ton of folks who are qualified to write because their audiences are so broad. But places that have to go deep with a specific audience, that have to convince folks, say professionals or people who have a deep interest in a specific subject matter, photography or engineering or something like that, know that they are going to those folks every year and asking for $150 for a subscription. Know that they have to give them really deep stuff every day, more than once a day. And know that there are not a lot of people around who can write at that depth and who are name brands within those very small communities. There, it's a bit more of a seller's market. Nothing is totally a seller's market in this world, but there aren't a lot of, for instance, Seemas who come along pitching a story to Scientific American blogs about why physicians should or shouldn't all have to get an influenza vaccine, which I think was one of the earlier ones that you pitched to them. You know, someone who's not only a physician, but an infectious disease epidemiologist with field experience. You know, there aren't a lot of those folks. And so if you are one of the few folks around and you're pitching into a niche publication, they sort of need to have you a bit more.
And it's helpful that you brought that up, Rob, because I'd forgotten about it, but it answers this question well, in that when I was in the journalism program, it was very much a program where you learn by doing. So from day one, you're learning the things that we're teaching you now, but, you know, more for the reporting side, and you're having to pitch people straight away. Otherwise you fail the program. And so I had actually pitched a story about mandatory vaccinations for healthcare workers, because we're seeing all these hospital outbreaks of flu and whooping cough where healthcare workers themselves are refusing to get vaccinated. I thought it was really interesting. I pitched it to Slate, and Slate said they would pay $70. I got in trouble with Rob because instead of pitching it in the way I should, I actually wrote it on spec, and he was like, "You don't do that. Your time is valuable. You don't pitch like that." But, you know, rookie mistake. And it wasn't a read piece; it was a reported piece. So Slate said yes, and then did something really weird, and we're like, "No, we're not interested anymore." And I was like, so gutted. I was like, "What? It's like one of my first pieces. What's happening? I don't understand this editorial process." But it can be really weird. And then after Slate said no, I was like, well, damn, what do I do now? And so I pitched to Scientific American, who offered me 10 times more. The fee was about $700. And I was like, how is this so, like, what? I didn't even know. No one talks about these things enough. It's not publicly available enough. So that's why I think partly there's that discrepancy where Slate will pay 70 at the time, This is 2013, and Scientific American just offered me, I think it was $650, but also, you know, almost 10 times more. So it just goes to show how precarious or weird that is.
Yeah. So I saw another question here. Another question. This is much more for you to answer than for me, I think, about whether women and members of minority groups are less likely to pitch, and what the reception seems to be for them when they do.
Yeah, I think we do. And I think we get paid less, and we're often willing to be paid less. The gender pay gap is very real. You may have seen just 2 days ago at the LA Times, one of their top food critics, who was brought in at the same time to be a co-critic with a white man, she's a Latina, found out she's getting paid less, and the LA Times won't make her pay equal to her male counterpart who does the exact same job. So that's not unique to journalism. That happens in medicine too. It happens in academia and science across the board. And so of course it happens in the journalism market as well, as freelancers too. I took a negotiations class at the Stanford Business School a few years ago, which changed my life and just made me very much less emotional and much more business-like and business-minded about negotiating. So now I just have a rule that I always ask for more. And oftentimes people say yes, sometimes they say no, and you know what, that's okay. But I think those same disparities we see in other fields, of course they apply here, unfortunately. I'll share with you really quickly, because I think this is important. A thing that I learned in Rob's journalism program, where we had a speaker come in, was that the speaker was talking about the different ways that people who identify as men versus people who identify as women had interactions with editors. So what happened, I think they were in a pub or a bar, and this one woman said to her group of freelance friends, oh, I got a rejection from an editor. I just got this email, it says, no, we're not interested, sorry. And so one of the guys, who was also a freelancer, said, okay, so what did you respond? And she was like, what do you mean? They don't want the story. They're not interested. And he was like, yeah, so what did you respond? And she was like, so nothing. Thank you for considering. And he was like, no, you just got a response from an editor. That's the beginning of a conversation. And that's the beginning of your opportunity to say, thanks for considering. I also have these other ideas, or thanks for considering, what are you looking for that no one's writing right now? And she was blown away by that. The women at the table were blown away by that. I think many of us in our program who were listening to her say it were like, oh, that's a thing you can do. And now I do that all the time, because I still get rejections, but I don't say thanks for considering. I say thanks for considering, thanks for the quick response. What about this idea? Or what else would you like to be seen that could be written by someone like me that's not coming across your desk? So I think there are some things that we can unlearn and some things that we can learn that can help us as well in a very unequal system.
Yeah, that's a great tip. That's a great tip. So another question here. I will disclose that you guys heard me mention my endocrinologist dad, at whose knee I sat doing my work while he was writing grants and journal
you mentioned
articles.
it about 4 times already.
Yes. So, and I did because I knew that he was in this call. And in fact, he has a good question here. There
Your
he is.
dad is here.
Yep. He is. So his question, but it's a really good question. I shouldn't say, but yes, and it's a really good question, is how about headlines, right? This is one thing that a lot of people ask about, because the headline can be like here, and the story is actually there, and everyone thinks they read the story, but actually all they did was read the headline. I'm very much guilty of that. I think most of us are. As one of my colleagues in political science once said, there are books, and then there are books that you've read yourself, right? There are articles, and then there are articles that you've actually read. So what about the headlines? Here's the unfortunate fact. Headlines, journalists do not write the headlines. This changes a little bit in some places now, but by and large, the headlines are the purview of the editor. And this is for a couple of important reasons, but it bears understanding. One is, if you're writing in print, which is less and less the case these days, editors, and this is historic, really had to sort of wait until the very last minute to decide what they could actually put in a headline. It was a function of the space they had, what ads are running on that page, what 5 other stories were running on that page, how big this story was running. Headlines might change. If a newspaper typically had 3 or 4 editions through the course of a night, headlines would actually change from the 10 p.m. edition through to the 3 a.m. edition that everyone saw, because there'd be new news breaking overnight, or you'd get a new picture that you wanted to throw in of the baseball game or whatever it was. So editors needed to write headlines. There's also an art to writing a headline.
Yes.
In the digital era, the equivalent is that headlines also have to work for search engine optimization. I have to know that it's going to pop up in social media, that it's going to pop up in search. There is not just an art, but increasingly a bit of a science to this. And so headline writing is a purview of editors who work on headlines. They usually, to give them credit, really get it right and match the headline up with the intent of the story. But sometimes they get it wrong. And and I see Seema shaking her head. From the perspective of the writer, they get it wrong more often than I think they actually probably do. But it's always a really sensitive thing because someone else is putting a title on your piece. You can sometimes ask to see it, but rarely will you get to because it'll come up at the last minute and it may not even be written by someone who you were working with. But that's just something to be aware of. If you do have, Seema will have some thoughts on this in a second, but what I just want to wrap up with one thing on this. If the headline is factually wrong, if the headline is fundamentally misleading, go right back to the editor and tell them why. If it's just not a headline you like and it's like, yeah, I don't really like it, leave that. Because if you complain too much to an editor for reasons that aren't great, then you're going to undermine the working relationship with them. But if the headline is actually misleading or inaccurate, go back to them and tell them why, and then let them write the next one. They might at that point actually even share the next one with you. So Seema, you've had more experience with this.
Let me give you my take on headlines because it's so important. Yes, it's a few words relative to the 800 or 1,000 you've written. That's so powerful, right? Which is why we need to talk about it. Let me tell you how much this changed. This is a great question. Thank you for the question. When I was first had my newspaper job, I didn't write the headline. I knew the people who did though, because they sat in a separate room and they were amazing. They wrote great headlines because it was part of their job as well as doing layout and other things. I would say within my second year in that newspaper job, it became my job to write the headline. And it wasn't that headline would eventually be the exact one, but I had to come up with something. It was a good exercise. And like I said, boiling down what really is in a nutshell your story about. But I'm like, there are people who are really good at this. Like, this isn't my strongest point. I'm good at writing a story. I'm really good at reporting, but condensing it into a snappy headline, it was very frustrating to me that became my job. The headline plus the subhead plus the rest of the story, then plus the captions for the photographs. As things became just much more centralized, it all landed on the reporter. And I won't even start lamenting about what might this look like for video and podcast, because that's a whole nother topic. The way this is now, let me give you a snapshot into a newsroom like Vox. As a reporter, you're going to write your piece and it's going to get sent to a copy desk, but then into the Slack for the newsroom, you have to submit about 10 headlines for your story. And what happens is those get upvoted, downvoted, and then about 3 or 4 get A/B tested online, meaning they get multiple headlines get used for the same story, and the metrics are reviewed in real time, which is getting the most clicks. This is why you might have seen that funny thing where you send a link to a friend because you're like, oh, you need to read this. And then you yourself go back and are like, wait, is it the same story? It looks different. And it's because the headline was tweaked. There are, in fact, some really good bots on Twitter, some accounts that do this. They show you how headlines change over time. The New York Times has one, a bot like that. So that's where we're at now, because it's so much about the clicks and it's so important to get eyes on the story. This is where I think you have to be careful and do keep an eye on what the headline is, and do not hesitate, as Rob said, to get in touch. You're like, no, come on, this isn't what the story about, or it's going to be misleading people. And on that note, this isn't about headlines, the images matter too. So if there's an image that ends up associated with your story and you're like, what the heck, speak up. Yeah, because that's also a part of your story, even though you perhaps didn't pick it. One thing that often happens, and this has been written about too, is for vaccination stories. There's a picture of a kid screaming, looking like they're screaming and in immense pain. And it's like, for most of us who have given pediatric vaccines, actually that it's not that bad. And they're a life-saving intervention. Why are we visually framing them as something that causes immense pain? Oftentimes when I've written stories about the Epidemic Intelligence Service, even though it's me writing it, and even though more than half of most EIS cohorts are women, the image that gets put is like a man in the field doing public health work. So, keep an eye on those things. That matters too.
You can, in fact, and you should think about images for your stories, right? It doesn't mean that they will necessarily run it, but
Yeah.
more and more editors actually want an image. It saves them time. A couple of things to think about with images. One, you need to make sure, well, the most important thing is that you need to make sure, I suppose say the two most important things. One, you need to make sure it's real. And the other is to make sure that you have the rights to it. And if you don't have the rights to it, if you pulled it from somewhere online, then you need to indicate that very clearly to the editor. I don't have rights to this. This is for illustrative purposes only. It gives you a sense of the kind of thing we're talking about. If you want to use this, just be really clear that, you know, I don't have the rights, but here's where I found it. And let them sort it out. But I think that that's having some kind of image, even if it's just to give them a sense of what you're thinking of,
Yeah. Good point.
is really helpful. You can also, you know, increasingly, you can sort of shoot your own images. It's not great necessarily. You should know what you're doing, but you know, smartphone cameras are actually good enough that you can. But you know, again, I think if you find images and you can send them with the link and explain where they're coming from and explain how you found it and be very transparent about it and say that you don't necessarily have the rights unless you do, they at least understand where you're going with it.
Yeah. Rob, I want to ask you this question because we're talking so much about op-eds and we're not talking about reported pieces. It means
Yep.
you're putting yourself and your expertise. And so we have this great question from
Yeah.
somebody in our session, and she's asking, do you have any advice on writing op-eds that criticize your place of work, for example, Stanford? And I can see why you would have picked Stanford. It's in the news a lot. Rob, you've given some really good counsel on this before. What would be like your best advice on that?
Be careful. You know, it really comes down to it comes down, well, there are a bunch of things it comes down to. The first thing is you have to make sure that you're actually legally in a position where you can do this, right? That it's actually safe for you to do. Safety is really important, particularly in a highly polarized environment right now. The US is more emblematic of this than Canada and than other countries, but just be aware. So, but I think, you know, if your job does not allow you to be open or to be to disclose things, then an op-ed isn't worth it, to be perfectly honest. Having said that, you know, there are all sorts of ways that you can do things like this. If there is something that is going wrong in your institution that you think people need to know, first of all, there should be channels within your institution, right, that you can actually complain up to. You may also not have a full sense of what's going, like this is going to sound very unjournalistic of me because you'd think that the journalist would say, like, get it out. No, but bear with me for a second. And then debate with me and tell me I'm totally wrong and I'm being too much of an institutional man here. Because I'm not just going to say don't do it. I'm saying be very careful. I've also worked on the institutional side. I spent, as Jonathan Berek pointed out at the beginning, I spent 5 years running communications for the University of Toronto. And I did so very much, you know, as a journalist, still in my value set and my thinking. But what I also realized, large institution, huge university, one of the largest in North America, is that people who think they know what the whole institution is doing usually don't. They know what's going on in their department, they know what's going on in their section, they know what's going on in their area.
Yeah, that might be valuable expertise to share though, right? That the piece of information that they are aware of.
Yes, but you have to be careful that you are not extrapolating beyond what you know, that you're not saying, you know, that a whole institution isn't providing PPE. As an example, this is an example that came up when we were talking in June. There was a physician in Houston, as the curve was starting to steepen there, who was talking about that and wanting to get that story out. We're like, well, is your institution not providing PPE, or is it providing PPE to a different area? Or is it just that your own department isn't getting? So know what you're actually talking about and talk within what you know, within that too. If you actually want to solve the problem as opposed to making a point, go through your channels first and see how far they go. If you get to a point where there is an important public interest issue at stake and the internal channels are not working, then I think, and you're in the middle of it, then I think it may be a wiser course to either go to another journalist, to actually bring it to a journalist who can report it well, who can report it beyond just your own interest, and who can also keep you safe, although that may or may not be an issue, but who can report it credibly and well and help them actually report it. That's exactly what Ed Snowden did. Edward Snowden didn't dump things like WikiLeaks. He said, are 3 journalists that I trust based on what they've done, I'm going to bring this all to them and help them. And there are whistleblower protections in many countries that will help you do that. But the final thing is, look, if it crosses all those hurdles and you still feel comfortable and you want to be out in the public space, and it's not something where there is, you know, an internal process, and I'm pretty secure in my job, or I'm okay with taking that risk, then yeah. But bear in mind, you know, just remember what it's going to be like to walk into work the next morning, and make sure, most importantly, make sure that you're right. Make sure, I'd say that's the most important thing. Make sure that you are right. That it's not just about your own corner, but that you're actually right. So Seema, over to you, because I think I've been maybe a little too much of the ivory tower institution man here on this, but.
Oh, okay, we'll have some balance, because I would say to this that, yeah, definitely an avenue that is open to you is approaching a journalist, and thank goodness for free press, right? The immune system of democracy, you can reach out. However, I think institutions are very powerful in upholding systems of oppression, and sometimes change can be very effective when it comes from within the organization. So you talk about safety. The first thing that I thought of when looking at that question was, oh, do you have tenure? What kind of support systems do you have within your network and within the institution itself? Because you may have that within your department, your division, and there are probably many others that are feeling the same way that you are. And therefore, can you form a coalition? Can you do what 100 or so Stanford medical faculty did earlier this year, which was to write an open letter against Scott Atlas and what he was saying about the COVID-19 pandemic response? And so definitely have your back, think about it. But if you're a person that has certain privileges, I don't know in this case, but say you are tenured, say you are white, say you are, you know, you have those privileges that just make your place safer, your perch safer in society, then, I mean, society relies on you to speak out about things that are egregiously wrong within institutions and that go unchecked. So that would be my counter to it. Yes, you have journalists that you could reach out to, but we're here to empower you so that you can write these kinds of things. And sometimes it might be appropriate for you to be the person that does write about something going on within your institution. Rob?
Yeah,
anything?
no, I think that this is exactly the balance to strike. I think the most important thing is be right, and so be disciplined about it. Like, we all have our visceral responses to, I do too, visceral responses to things going on in our close quarters.
Yeah.
And I have to sit long enough and stop long enough to ask, do I understand this? Do I understand like, when I write this thing, if I were to, and I haven't, but if I were to write this thing about this particular thing that's pissing me off, if I were to write this, would the people who are reading it in the privacy of their own house, when they're not sort of in front of anyone else, would they sort of nod and say, yep, he's right, I can't argue with it? Or would they say, he doesn't really understand, he hasn't sort of, you know, approach this with discipline and with an open mind to get.
But I don't know if that's the binary that I look at, because I don't know an op-ed if the goal is to have someone read something and think she is right. I know the world as she does. It's to offer another informed perspective.
It is, but I think the important thing is to be credible, right?
Totally.
I think it's important to be credible and to be accessible to others.
One way that you do that, because in any given situation, you won't have interviewed all the sources available for a story. Yeah. You won't have read everything on the literature, is to mark out your boundary and say, this is what I know about. Yeah. This is what I can speak to. There's a circle outside of this that I'm not privy to, that I don't have that information. So within the confines of my remit of, you know, what I know, let me tell you about that. And I think that's one thing that we should do more of, actually, because it's about being more honest about what we know and what we don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
A great question. Thank you. So because the questions are so good and so relevant, let's answer two more. One is going to be a really quick one. And then let's go on to the next parts, because we only have less than an hour to talk about pitching and editing, which is going to be really exciting. So one quick question I just wanted to do, somebody wasn't clear about the kicker. They think they missed it. The kicker is just the last component, the last graph or two of your story, where you're wrapping things up. And I was making that point that it's okay to leave some things untied there. It's okay to leave some questions unanswered, where people want to go on and read more, maybe follow you because they know you're going to be covering that beat and writing more about it. So the kicker is just the end part. And I was emphasizing that we don't do and more research is needed to answer this question, which is a norm within scientific academic writing. Anything to add there, Rob? Otherwise, I want to pose another question to you.
There's sometimes little devices that people use. If you started off with an anecdote, you can wrap it up back with that anecdote a little bit. You know, if you started off with, I left a patient and I can't get her out of my mind. And now you've sort of gone on with the whole issue that comes out of that. And then, and even tonight, as I sit down, I still think of her, something like, sometimes you can wrap it up that way.
Yeah. So the question I want to ask you, we may need to workshop this a little bit, but I think it's so critical and maybe on many people's minds, is that whole thing of like, well, I study TB and I want to talk about how it's really hard to fund research on TB. How can we help, in this case, Richard, whose statement, and this was early on, Richard was asking this, we just started, so we hadn't talked about goals and outlines and stuff, but this is a thing that can be tricky. So if you have an idea like, how do you increase funding for tuberculosis research or treatment, how do we go from there, Rob, to, okay, the thing that I can pitch an editor, the thing that I can write my op-ed about is, because we all struggle with that sometimes.
Right. So I'd sort of love to go, does someone have the slides?
Yeah, I do. Which one do you want?
Can you go back to the Venn diagram slide?
Yeah.
Because then I can speak to that for a sec.
Sure.
It's a great question, right? If you come off, if you pitch a story, and it could be TB, it could be, I saw someone else had a question about rare diseases or stuff like that. If you pitch a story that's too much out of your corner, just putting your hand up and saying, everyone pay attention to me, to me, to me, to me, the editor will be like, well, yeah, okay, that's great, but there are 4,000 different people I should pay attention to. It's like everyone wants a national, in this country anyway, in Canada, everyone wants a national strategy for something, a national strategy for osteoporosis, a national strategy for perinatal depression, everyone wants an, okay, so it's all meritorious, right? But the editor will be asking, why is this really, let's go to that third question. Why is this thing about TB really important to my readers? So let's say you're working in the United States. TB is endemic in certain populations and others don't even think it exists anymore. A lot of places don't, a lot of people, living in urban, middle class, upper middle class America don't even think TB exists anymore. But if you're in a First Nations community or a prison, or you have relatives in any part of Africa, it exists. But why is it important, right? So that's the first thing that you need to sort of think about. This is not just important for my career. This is important because, and let's put this in the time of COVID, as we focus so much on COVID, there are other really critical things that we thought we were on the path to licking that are now falling apart. Measles, by the way, is the big one, right? We flirted with that a couple of years ago and now it's back. The number of people have missed pediatric vaccinations over the last year. There was a story about this I saw this morning, but TB is a classic, right? Because we're talking about respiratory infectious disease, same kind of thing, right? But as we solve one virus and we're messing up on bacterium and on a whole other thing that we're letting lost, this thing will rear its ugly head. So how do you pitch that? Yes, great news, hook it to what's happening now. Great news on the possibility of vaccine. Great news that we may actually be able to get this in a year, or two, get enough people vaccinated. But by the time we get to that, let's look at all this other stuff that's coming up that I'm really worried about. And one of them is tuberculosis. This disease we thought we had on the run is going to stage a comeback, and the early data are suggesting we're on the back foot right now. And then whatever those data are. So what's the best thing we can do? Well, one thing is we can actually still pay attention to all the basic public health stuff you need to prevent that. And by the way, it's not so different. The second thing is we can continue to invest in research. And then you can throw out some tantalizing stuff. We were on the verge of, and I don't know TB science right now, but we were on the verge of this. We were on the verge of that. Polio, I know, totally different, obviously, but polio, I know, they were on the verge of, like, the last couple of states in northern Nigeria were on the verge of getting their vaccines, right? We were on the verge, just got pulled out from us. So you're raising some tension, and that makes it relevant to me and makes me risk of overwhelming me. So the kicker on that might be, that said, there is a really clear path forward and it's not hard. Bang, bang, bang. That's not even the kicker. That might be the story. That's how I would approach something like that.
Oh, that's a good point that you raised, that might not be the kicker, it might be the story, because we didn't talk about burying the lead, which is a term I'm sure everyone's heard about, but going back to that structure that we shared, that your lead needs to come high up. So just bear that in mind. But also on this point about, like, here's the thing I want to write about TB, don't forget that element that's going to come like in the second part of your story structure, which is why should the reader care? Of course, you're then thinking about who is the reader? Are you publishing this somewhere where policy makers will read it? Is it for mothers? Is it for people in a community where there's high incarceration rates? But you're always thinking about why should you care? And as Rob was talking, I was like, this is really important. We need more people writing about this, but how would you make my auntie who lives in Southern California care? Or my other auntie who lives in Houston, Texas care? Like the measles is not on their mind right now. TB, they don't think affects them. So always going back to that point that you care passionately, but please remember to articulate that high up in your op-ed, what's at stake here? Why should you, the person spending a few minutes of your precious day, why should you care?
So, and metaphors are good here. And at the risk of continuing to, refer to my dad, I'll refer to something that I remember to say, because this is useful in talks too, when you're speaking to audiences that are not right in your little research area. My dad spent his career doing research on diabetes-related atherosclerosis and heart disease. Sounds obscure. Obviously, any doctor knows that it's not. But if you're a GP, there are a ton of other things you're also looking at. But I remember going to a talk that he gave, I think in Spain at a conference, and he threw up a slide. And I think, you're competing against all the endocrinologists are looking at 1,000 different things, 1,000 different complications of diabetes. And he threw up a slide and said, every 2 years, a city the equivalent of Reno dies because of this, right? So that kind of stuff. Every year, a city the equivalent of Reno dies from tuberculosis, a disease that most Americans thought we'd more or less wiped out. No, and it's about to get worse. Measles, because it's sort of like salmon and tuna, because they both come in tins. I always used to think they were the same size, because measles and chicken pox are both vaguely pediatric. I think they're the same. Measles can kill, excuse my language, and is highly contagious, et cetera, all the stuff the docs know, but I don't know because I'm just a layperson. So use the metaphors, right? That's what drives home that second point of why this is important.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And we might have to bleep out your F-bombs. But it does bring me to this question from Katrine about, can you be funny? And she's asking because she wrote an article, but many readers didn't quite understand the more sarcastic remarks. I understand that because I'm a Brit and I think sarcasm isn't very well understood in America sometimes. It depends very much on your audience, right? It depends on your circle. So I come back to that, Katrine, that you're thinking about who's reading this. Is it policy wonks in DC, or thinking about your audience and therefore what's going to hit home for them. In some cases, humor is so powerful. I'm actually teaching about a class about the power of humor in business next week, because it's so important in crisis and resilience. In other cases, if that humor falls flat, like you had that experience of people not really understanding what was wit and sarcasm versus what was fact. So you have to be really careful at how that's communicated. But this is a good segue to our next part, because we're going to talk about editors again, because so much of it comes down to a good editor as well. A good editor is worth their weight in gold, or maybe at least silver, because they know the target audience even better than you do. And you know them well because you've done your due diligence, you've done your research, but they know what's going to hit and what's going to miss. And this is why, some of you are asking about in the Q&A, you're asking about publishing essays on Medium. Of course, I mean, one of the beautiful things about the internet and social media is everyone's a publisher. For me, the valuable thing about going through the process and the rigmarole of doing all of this, like the writing, the structuring, the pitching, is because working with an editor just elevates your work, and working with a good editor really elevates your work, makes you a better reporter and writer in the long run. It just makes each of your pieces, it can make them sing. You start off with something great, it becomes amazing. As someone who writes books as well, I think it's so negligent that we don't get to credit the editors, because they just make things amazing. So that's also why we're here, because we want you to have the benefit of that relationship. And so in our 45 minutes roughly that are remaining, we do want to talk about pitching, and we want to talk about the editing process. So Rob, do you want to get us started with some of that, and I can share the slide we have?
Yeah, please do. And actually one way into this is a question, again, I don't remember who had it, but it was, basically, how do I find the contacts and so on.
So we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of that.
Exactly. So is that where you want me to start? Just sort of right up at the top of that kind of thing? Okay.
And
my
wait, Rob, let me just say, because basically we're saying that now we've gone through what you need to know about the things that you should consider early on when you have your idea. You're thinking about what's the editor thinking. Now we've given you a structure. We're telling you have to do some reporting. You have to write it on spec. So then, like, if I'm handing that to you now and I'm like, hey, I've written this document, then what?
And you've written you've written something to the right length, right? Because you know typically how much you've looked on their website, you've counted the words, you know how much they normally take, and also importantly, just to reiterate, you're writing an argument, not just a question. You're not raising a question about a topic. You're actually writing an argument about a focus thing. Okay, so now you have your thing. By this point, you've already sort of figured out what kind of outlets you might want to pitch to. Excuse my dangled participle there. You figured out your target outlets. You may want to think about some more in the course of writing it. You may have sort of changed your thinking a little bit. But very simply, go to those places and fish around online for a contributor's guidelines. They don't all have them. It's a bit spotty. But particularly if you go often to the opinion section, if you go to the bottom of the page on the opinion section, there might be something that is, contributors or submissions. Sometimes it's under the About Us. And in the same way that academic journals will be very specific about the guidelines that they want from their contributors, a lot of outlets are as well. And they'll sort of ask you the kinds of questions that we had on that previous slide, but in their own form and stressing their own things. They'll also tell you what they're not interested in, and they'll talk about sort of length and so on. So you guys are all familiar with this from grant applications and from academic publishing. So our world has the same thing. Very importantly, before, and frankly, you should have done this even before you started writing, make sure that you are not pitching them a story that or an idea or a column that they've already run. We do that in my program. So we send out probably 10 pitches a week, every week for 8 months. And in the course of that, inevitably 3 or 4 times, we pitch places things that we should have known they've already run before. And I could tell you that there's a fair bit, and these are relationships that we have, institutional relationships that I have with the editors of these places. And I have to do a lot of crow eating quick emails to folks, because when an editor sees something that you're pitching and they've already covered, the message to them is, you don't even read me. Right. So why would I bother running anything from you? It's an insult, actually, right? Now, conversely, if you do see something that they've covered and you still want to contribute and you think they slightly covered it wrong, or that in covering it, they may have gotten it basically right, but they missed something, then you can actually say, you guys already own this. Congratulations. You are way out ahead of everyone else. This piece is going to deepen your reader's understanding of the issue and build on that great coverage you've already had. Please find attached, or please find below in this email, right? So, but you have to relate it to what they've been covering before. Those I think are the key things in terms of identifying the folks that you want to go to. There are or the ways you want to pitch. More and more outlets have just submission kind of engines, bots, where they ask you, please pitch here. There is a form, you need to pitch here. And they do that because otherwise they're overwhelmed. And these are systems that can automate a little bit, can sort of prioritize for them, for their editors, so that they can then go into this. They can also then begin to track the editing process because it goes, an idea that they've taken will go into their content management system and so on. If they want you to pitch through that tool, do that. Don't ignore that. You can, if you, it depends on how kind of hustly you are around this. You can also send it to an editor directly and say, look, I've submitted this through your tool, but I also just wanted to make sure that you saw it. You may or may not hear anything back. If they don't have a tool, or even in that case, if they do have a tool and you want to submit it directly to an editor, how do you find that editor? Understand the section. So you've gone to the website of the news organization that you've picked, or maybe a couple of news organizations that you've picked. You have identified the section that it is most likely to sit in. That may be an idea section, the Sunday review section, it may be a science section that has a sort of an opinion area. Who knows what it is, right? But you've identified the section where it seems like it would fit, and you have an idea of why. And then you can go to about, to team, to what we used to call the masthead, which is the list of the top editors, but often it's under sort of about us and the team and so on. And you can identify, hopefully, the editor of that section. They may or may not have their email accessible. It's usually a good sign of their openness to freelance stuff. That's usually a good sign. If they do have their editors' emails accessible, it's a sign that they're interested in having stuff. If they don't, it's a bit more of a hassle. It does not mean that you're not welcome to come, but you have to do a little bit more work. You could call the front office and just ask them, who is the section editor? How can I get to them? Or you can look and try to look for emails, from other people who are at that organization and see the format and then sort of guess your way in. I just did this with the WHO. I needed to get something from them. I'm sure people on this call do that.
Did it work, Rob?
It did. I got, I guessed, well, in this case, I needed to get a document because I'm also doing some science communication consulting here now around COVID. And they've just done some very interesting work in Europe. And I needed to get a document which was no longer available. So I saw the couple of authors, which they don't really prioritize usually. They didn't have contacts, but there was another WHO Europe formatted email that I found. I did that format to two of them and then found someone else, one of the co-authors' old email address from an earlier document that she'd been a consultant on, and it was her MSN address. And I just sort of sent it to all of them, and then I got an email back the next business day.
Very reporter-like of you.
Yeah, so we can all work that way, right? So I think that's sort of, I'll stop there and hand over to you, Seema, because the sound of my own voice starts to get on my nerves after a little while.
No, I think you covered some key points. Some of the questions coming in are relevant because Eric is asking, do you have thoughts on pitching a story to print versus digital publications? I think that's a good question for both of us to think about, Rob.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I often work with outlets that are both. They are print and digital, and they mostly purport to have a digital first strategy or digital first approach, meaning that you're always thinking about what's going to be on the website. And then what's happened at the New York Times is when I've had op-eds published there, they'll say, oh, our print editor would like to use your story for the Sunday opinion section. Can they cut 3 paragraphs out because we only have this many inches? Your story was 1,000 words. We need it to be less than 750, for example. So that's what often happens is you're thinking about the digital and then it ends up in print. However, just broadly speaking about thinking about those outlets, the Voxes and the BuzzFeeds of the world, or the NPRs that have the websites, to me, I don't take a different approach if I'm pitching those. To me, the mechanics and the systems behind the scenes still kind of operate the same way when you're outside of the organization and you're trying to get an opinion piece published. Would you agree with that, Rob? Are you doing anything differently or advising your students to do anything differently?
I don't make any distinction. And I think of all media now. I mean, I'm actually one of the last people I know around who still gets 2 newspapers at the door. Not quite sure why I do. But I think of all media now as digital. But there is a distinction that Seema is drawing between what they call sort of digital native and then the folks whose roots are still in print. The one that again, I'll use a Canadian pronunciation, the corollary to this distinction is, and I think it's becoming a more profound distinction in written media, is the source of revenue. Are they advertising generated? Or are they audience generated? Or in the case of places like Canada and Britain, Australia, are they actually funded by the public sector, like the CBC, the ABC, and the BBC? So let's put those guys to one side for a second. They're generally, in my experience, although they increasingly have some op-ed stuff, they're generally less interested in that because they're publicly funded. I'll just put them to one side because they're different. The real distinction I would draw is between folks that still prioritize the advertiser or think they do, or haven't figured out not to, and folks who prioritize the reader. Everyone is moving towards prioritizing the reader, but the ones who've gotten that in really in their DNA are the ones who want a lot of smart content all the time and have an almost insatiable appetite for it. Doesn't mean they'll always pay for it, but they have a more insatiable appetite, and they also are more closely connected to what their readers are interested in, I would say. And a lot of digitally native places are like that. So we're focused on our reader. We understand our reader well. We're watching them all the time.
Yeah, and I'm going to speak a bit more on this now. We're going to talk a bit more about the pitching and editing process. But in the meantime, if there are things that we are saying that make you feel stuck, you don't know how to work past certain blocks, please put those into the Q&A and we'll make sure we address those when we get to that next. So Rob, we're talking about how to find the right person to pitch to, because we already narrowed down who our first outlet's going to be, right? We've made our list of the appropriate outlets. We've done our reading. We're making sure no one else has already run this story in them. We're reaching out to editor number one. We're using the bot that they say you have to use. Maybe we're trying to copy the actual editor's address by guessing the format or whatever. But can we talk a bit more about what goes in the email? Because when it comes to pitching a reported story, we often use, I teach a template that you taught me, because you're not sending the whole story, right? With a reported story, you're sending the pitch only. So what do you think works best when you're writing a whole op-ed and submitting that? What should go in the email?
Right. So email should be very short, and it should introduce, it sort of works on the same principle as what we would call the pitch in a reported piece, which is basically, here is the story in a nutshell. Here's why it's important. It's almost like 4 or 5 lines and not more. Dear so-and-so, I am a blank, so you're establishing credibility up front. I'm a professor of oncology at so-and-so. Please find attached an opinion piece that I've written which argues that, in one sentence. I think it's critical for your readers, or that your readers might be interested because of the outstanding coverage you've done on this topic in the last month, and then you might cite a couple of things to show that it builds on something. And because it brings these discussions to a surprising or interesting or counterintuitive but important conclusion. 1, 2, 3, just that, right? Why is this counterintuitive and surprising? Why is it important to your readers, showing that I know who your readers are? And why am I actually credible, the credible person to be pitching this to you? Why am I not, just because you've actually already raised this, a radiologist talking about viruses? Sorry, I want to say that out loud, but you already mentioned it.
I would reiterate that the editor is busy. They are hungry for content because they need something to publish, but they want to be able to make that decision about what to publish or not very quickly. So in that email, it's very short. It's going to say who you are, why you're the right person to write this. It's going to say why this is timely, because you're answering the questions, why me, why now, why this? And you're trying to do that in as few sentences as possible. So write it, but then write it as a draft and then edit your email so that it really is punchy. And you're saying, here's what my attached op-ed says. This is why I'm the right person to write about it. And this is why you need to publish it at the moment.
Sorry, I was just going to say, if you want a good exercise or sort of want to internalize the process of what it is to take a complex story, right, that's been rattling around in your brain for a long time and put it into a grabby sentence, spend a lot of time with the website of your favorite news organization, just the homepage. Everyone does it. So the New York Times, NPR, the Globe and Mail in Canada, the Guardian, whoever it might be, the BBC even, they will all tease these stories inside the Financial Times. They'll all tease it in 3 sentences or 2 sentences. That is where you make the decision on whether to click through or not. So all you're doing is you're doing the same thing for the editor. You are inviting the editor to open the attachment. So write up that story, highlighting the tension, the importance, the counterintuitiveness, whatever its strongest suit is, the nowness, right, the timeliness of it, whatever its strongest suit is, in 3 sentences. And it should feel as if those were the 3 sentences on the homepage of the Guardian, the New York Times, the Times of India, whatever it is.
Yeah, this is why we always come back to, if you're going to be writing, you have to be reading, you have to be consuming a lot, and especially from the outlets that you want to be pitching to. Okay, so now we're at the point where we've gone over our goals, we know which editors to pitch to, we've done our research, now we have a structure, we've written the op-ed, we've pitched the email, we've pitched the editor with a really concise email that's punchy, hits all of that. The editor needs content, so they're going to get back to us very quickly, right, Rob?
Depends on whether someone who lost an election is actively trying to stage a coup in the White House. Depends on whether there's a war in northern Ethiopia and you are pitching to a newspaper in Kenya. It depends on all the things that are going on that are occupying her time. The other thing to remember that this is what, to go back to that example, the metaphor I was using before, the emerge doc, but in a place without any actual processes, right? So the emerge doc at least can rely on the fact that there's a sophisticated triage process ahead of her. In a newsroom, the way the editor is working is, I'm editing, I'm editing, I'm editing, I'm editing, I'm editing, I'm editing. I can't talk, I can't talk, I can't talk. And then the blinders come off and I have 500 emails and the president has just done something stupid or smart or whatever. I'm not going to stay in opinion, but the president just done something we have to cover. And oh my God, I have a daughter and she's still at daycare and I forgot to pick her up 2 weeks ago and I don't know where she is, right? And that is the context in which your email is being read. So they may come back to you very quickly, they may not. You'll have timeliness issues, right? If there is something that is really timely, or if you want to get on and pitch somewhere else, if you don't hear back, well, Seema, you have your process for this. My instinct is, if you don't hear back in a couple of days, remind them. And if you still don't hear back, you haven't heard back and take it elsewhere. If you, anyway, I'll leave it at that, but there may be, sorry, Seema, why don't you go? I'm just having a bit of a brain blank.
No, sure. I'll just carry off on that because the timeliness thing is really tricky in that there's no science to this as to exactly how you should word the email regarding how much time you want to give the editor. You don't want to sound like a jerk and be like, you have until 5 p.m. today to get back to me because I'm so important and this is so good, right? They're busy people too. They do want to get to your email. But if it's not like we talked about a news hook, so clearly everything needs to have an element of timeliness, but not everything is breaking news. Not everything needs to go to print that day or the next day. So sometimes in the email, I will politely say, I would like a response back by the end of day tomorrow if it's really timely, or the end of the week, by which point, if I haven't heard back from you, I'll be pitching to other outlets. What can happen is sometimes you get a response quickly, a no or a yes, say it's a yes, and then you're like waiting to hear back more. That's often where the lag happens for me. And then sometimes the lag is long. And then suddenly you hear back, like, we need your thoughts on these edits by the end of the day. And you're like, wait, what? I have like other things to do. So just be mindful of that. I just want you to be aware that it's not always the smoothest process. Sometimes it is, but other times it's like you're waiting ages and suddenly you're being told to like, hurry up, really. Yeah.
If they've said yes, and then you don't hear for a long time, which is entirely natural, and your story starts to move, or it becomes really timely now, or suddenly, I have a good example of this I'll go through in a second. You can ping them and let them know, this would be a great time to run it. So the example, this is that Boston Globe example, Seema, that I was, right? So a story we had last year from a really great woman, Akila Wise, just finished her doctorate or postdoc in public health from Emory. I believe from Emory. She might have been at Michigan. I forget where her degree and where her postdoc ran. It's not important. Did a story I think she pitched it last October, so about a year ago this time, about stop and frisk, which is the term of art in the US, in particular in New York, for what in Toronto we call carding, the practice by police of sort of targeting young Black men and just stopping them in the street and effectively interrogating them for no particular reason. So she wrote a really compelling piece about the actual physiological effects that this has, and how this actually has some pathological effects on people's health and creates levels of stress and et cetera. There are some real health effects to that are experienced in communities that have a high level of stop and frisk. So she wrote it. Boston Globe was very interested. They said yes. She wrote it, finished it up. They had a couple of edits. That was in October and November of 2019. And then nothing happened. Then we went to Christmas and nothing happened. And I think there was a lot of other stuff going on in the world. And then COVID started to happen. And then so they were busy. And then Michael Bloomberg decided that he wanted the Democratic nomination and jumped in. And the first thing that happened to his candidacy, few of us can probably even remember back that far, but the first thing that happened to his candidacy was people started coming out and saying, stop and frisk. You're the guy who brought it into New York. How can you have the nerve to campaign for the Democratic Party when you never even apologized for that? And suddenly her thing was there. Now, the editors of the Boston Globe had totally forgotten about it by this point. It had fallen in the cracks. We'd followed up a couple of times and they'd said, yeah, yes, we still like it. We'll get to it. We're really busy. We're short staffed. We're changing editors, whatever the excuse might be. But when the Bloomberg thing happened, we jumped on it. One of my colleagues who was editing her thing within the program jumped on it and went right out to the editor and said, this would be a perfect time. And they're like, oh my God, we'd forgotten about it. You're absolutely right. Let's put a new top on the story that hooks it to Bloomberg, but the rest of it stands. And they ran it within, I think, 24 hours. And it was a top story on their ideas section, but it ran 5 months after we'd submitted it, or 4 months after we submitted it, when the timing was right. So you can remind editors of that. And if you're really sitting on it and it really looks like they've lost it, they don't care, or whatever, you can tell them, look, if you don't run, if you don't mind, I'd like to pull it back and pitch it somewhere else. It's a risk because you may not land it anywhere else and they might be pissed off. But it sort of depends on whether you genuinely feel like you're losing the opportunity for the story. I would do that really as a last resort, though.
So Divya has a great question on this. She's saying, do you write your time-sensitive op-ed in advance, given that it may not be accepted, so that you can turn it around quickly?
Always, yeah. So our perspective on time as journalists is always forward-looking, right? It's always forward-looking. We're not writing about, for instance, I got a story idea, a pitch in our program. It's very interesting, but it was hooked to Kamala Harris's election as vice president-elect, or Kamala Harris's, election as vice president-elect. Interesting story. Would have been interesting had we actually gotten the pitch a couple of weeks before that, but because it came late, it was just, like the world had moved on. Ways to move that forward. There are ways to sort of advance that and think of the next step, and that's what we started to work on. But your view should always be prospective. What's coming up? Remember, you read the news because you want a briefing on what you should be thinking about for the next week, 2 months, 6 months, whatever it is.
That's a great point. So say you do get a yes. I want folks to be really as aware as we can make them, Rob, about what to expect from the editing process, because it can be quite different to doing this through the academic route. So what might be some of the best advice that we can give in terms of what to expect when you receive those edits and best ways of interacting with your very busy editor?
So I'll start and then you can continue. So recognize, I think a good premise, and it's not unlike the premise of publishing in the academic in the academic literature, is that the story, when it runs, or the opinion, it's a little bit different with an op-ed than with a reported story, but when it runs, it is not just your property anymore, right? It's that medium's property. So it carries both of you. It's not just up to you. If the editor is looking at this and saying, I know that you think the most important part of the story is here, I could tell you that for my readers, the most important part of the story is here. So this is the thing I want to emphasize. You should be able to go along with that. You should be able to go back and forth and have a good constructive conversation with that, up to a point. And this is where opinion pieces are maybe a little different. It is going under your byline. It is an opinion piece. Make sure that it reflects your opinion, but don't be petty about it, is I suppose what I'd be saying. I also draw a line around inaccuracy. Editors, because they don't know the issue as well as you, not because they're malicious, not because they have a political agenda necessarily. Some places do. A lot of places have much less of one than you would think. But because we have, like, speaking as an editor, I have a sense of what I find compelling and sexy and interesting about the story, and that's the piece I want to drill down on. I might heighten attention or heighten something that feels new, make it a little more dramatic. I have to know, and the editor wants to know and needs to know, if they are pushing this outside of the realm of accuracy. And if they are, you have to signal that to them. But if they aren't, if it's just like, I wanted this to be about why blue jackets are nice, and the editor is like, actually, I loved your piece because it just told me that jackets are worth wearing and we're forgetting to wear jackets. Can we tweak a little bit more there? Do you feel comfortable with that? They're like, yeah, blue jackets being nice is sort of a subset of jackets are important. So we can tweak it that way if you'd like. Be comfortable getting into a reasonable dialogue with them about it. Don't be petty, but also, remember, it's your opinion. Here's the other thing. they will copy edit. They are good writers. Editors are writers, so they are good writers. So they know how to make your stuff sing. Don't get into fights with editors about like this. Really, there's no point in going here. Oh, I love that sentence. That was the sentence that reminded me of my grandmother, and I really wanted that in there. No, it's not that. That's where it's really important to understand. This is not just your product anymore. They know how to communicate with their audience, and frankly, they'll make it look and sound punchy and buzzy within the realms of accuracy. So don't be precious about your word choices, about your turns of phrase. Just
Yeah.
don't.
And I would say for many of us in medicine, especially, we come from a very, very hierarchical structure, which if you're at the top of that food chain, you might be more inclined to be like, no, but this is right, this sentence needs to stay. When I actually transitioned from medicine to working in a newsroom, whatever my editor said, I would take it. I'd be like, yes, of course he's right. And it took me a while to learn. I could argue and I could say, no, this bit needs to stay in, or you're right about this, but I disagree with you about that, because I came from a structure where if someone hired, your boss said, you do this, you just did it, which isn't necessarily a great thing about medicine, but just be mindful of how that might impact it. I want to just say something about fact checkers, because that's another really crucial part of the editing process. Ideally, you will work with one, but you may be surprised that not every outlet, even some of the major outlets, they actually don't have fact checkers, which can be a little disconcerting when you first learn that. It can be, on the other side of the spectrum, it can be a very, very rigorous process, to the point that one time when I was working with this summer with a New York Times editor on an opinion piece, she said, right, okay, now my fact checker will be in touch with you, just giving you a heads up. She fact checks everything, will make you question even your own existence. Like, she'll make you feel like you have to prove that. And it was really rigorous. And what was upsetting about it wasn't the rigor. It was that my opinion piece was posted in the same week, it was June of this year, that Tom Cotton's op-ed was published in the New York Times, which very clearly was not fact checked because it contained historical inaccuracies, and then it was brought down, and then the opinion editor who published that lost their job. So then it comes back to that whole thing. Wait, why are some of us so rigorously fact checked? And I had to prove everything. I had to take out some lines because someone wouldn't admit to saying them. And I was like, this is a really important thing I'm saying about the HIV epidemic and how it was mismanaged. And people, so I had to take out things that I was like, no, I believe there's evidence for this. But then someone else, a very powerful person, got something into the paper that was clearly inaccurate and caused lots of problems for the New York Times. Be ready to work with a fact checker, which I'll give you a heads up. The best way that I think to do this is that as you are drafting your piece, add in footnotes, add in links, so that you just know where you got certain things from, where your sources are. Because what you'll often have to do is, once the editor has said, yes, great, I'm going to edit this, the fact checker will ask for an annotated copy, meaning they want to know where you got which information from, which page of the report. They just want to verify. And it's a great thing, right? It covers your butt too. It makes sure that what you're putting out, that you haven't misread something or misinterpreted something. I always think it's a privilege to work with a fact checker, even though it's annoying. It feels annoying. It feels like hassle, but it just makes your piece that much more solid. So I hope that you end up in situations where you do work with fact checkers, but those are some of my thoughts on how to best work with them. It's much more likely you'll work with a fact checker if you're publishing something with a magazine. There's a great Twitter thread from somebody at Wired who actually breaks down why is that magazines have fact checkers, and actually even some of the biggest daily newspapers do not, and they probably should. But Rob, do you have any thoughts or guidance about the fact checking process, and also the way that we should fact check our own stuff too? It's an opinion piece, but still has to be fact checked.
No, you absolutely, thank you for that. So I have rarely, if ever, worked with fact checkers because I come from a newspaper world, and it's not part of the newspaper culture. And in fact, I'd always wondered why it wasn't part of the newspaper culture. So I'd be curious to look at that. Yeah,
it's actually like this. There's a hierarchy that magazines have the best, the most thorough fact-checking system, people dedicated. Then some newspapers do, many don't, and then books, forget about it. Like, unless you're paying thousands of dollars for your own fact checker, which makes you, once you've been through that process, you're like, wait, there's so many other books I've read, were they not fact checked? And then it makes you start double thinking, triple thinking about whether you should even cite books as an original source.
So as a former newspaper reporter, I would say, but a newspaper reporter at a place that really was incredibly rigorous in its reporting, at the Wall Street Journal, I'll say that. we were expected to do our own fact checking, which sounds a little weird because we're not objective on it, but this is the basic approach that we would take, particularly on a longer piece. You write the piece, right, and it's on your screen, and then you just want to press send, or maybe you read it through once on your screen, and then you want to press send. You're done. You think it's awesome, and because there are a few turns of phrase that you love, you sort of get caught up in it as you do that. And you miss things, right? Or you gloss over things, or there was something that, yesterday when you were writing, you thought, I'll get back to that, and then you sort of glossed over to rephrase, and you never really got back to it. So a couple of quick tips. One, print it out. Don't read it on a screen. I don't know why. There's probably some neurologist or, ophthalmologist who could tell us why, but somehow for me anyway, reading it on paper does not allow me to read it as quickly as I do when I'm on a screen. So I would suggest printing it out. I would also suggest that one of the reads you do with it, this is going to sound weird, is to read it backwards, right? I don't mean like every word, because then it wouldn't make sense. But read the last paragraph, and then read the second last paragraph, and then read the third last paragraph, and read that way back through to the front. What it does is it breaks up the flow of thinking, and it forces you to realize that every fact, every paragraph, every sentence has to stand on its own. And it will, and then you're looking at details, right? So look at, when you refer to, it's this level of detail that you have to get right. When you are referring to someone, this happens to me all the time. People refer to me as Dr. Steiner. There's only one Dr. Steiner at the University of Toronto. He's the other guy on the call. I am not a doctor. I am an assistant professor. So people can call me, and even calling me Professor Steiner is a little weird because I'm an assistant professor, but fine, they could do that if they want. But, when you were going through, your titles, is this person a doctor? Is this person a professor? When you're going through a company, is it Inc. or Co. or Ltd.? It's that level of detail. If you want a good sense of the level of detail that you want to get right, the Associated Press or the Canadian Press in Canada have style guides online. Now, editors will watch for that carefully with op-eds because they know that you guys are professionals. But at the very least, you want to make sure that you have spellings of names right, titles right, cities' names right, and basic facts right. So go through, read it backwards. And the other little trick I like is to actually check off each word as I read, because that forces me to actually see if I'm spelling the name right, or if I knew how to spell it off the top.
Yeah, our brains fill in lots of gaps. So you can have a sentence with and missing or the missing, and your brain will put it in. It's a little bit harder to miss that if you've printed it out and you're reading it out loud, and then also doing the backwards thing that you say. So I definitely recommend the printing it out and reading it out loud. The other thing that I do is highlight everything that is a fact that can be checked. And the reason for doing this is because, one, we don't want you to get any of the information wrong. But the other thing is that even when you think it's a small error or a small oversight, actually it can discredit your whole thing. And so I'll give you one example. I remember when I was first a reporter at the Dallas Morning News, I was covering Ebola before it had arrived in Dallas. And I was looking at a story about the mathematical modeling of where the Ebola epidemic might spread to. And so I was looking at all these models of different airports in the US, and then I was writing about Houston Airport because there was some statistical chance that there would be somebody with Ebola arrive in Houston. Ended up being Dallas, but anyway. And I remember in the paper, in the copy I sent to the editor, I'd written Houston Hobby Airport, and my editor actually called me up, and I remember where I was because I was so embarrassed by this. I was in my car outside of getting groceries, and he was like, "It's not Houston Hobby Airport." And I was like, "Excuse me?" He was like, "It's William P. Hobby Airport." And I was like, "Oh my God, this stuff really matters." And that was one of my first stories. So it does.
Yeah.
If you say Hobby Airport and the real name is William P. Hobby Airport and you did not check that, then what else in your story did you not check?
Right.
And I promise you, the one time that you don't ask someone to spell their name because their name is Tom, they will spell their name Thomme. So you just have to, I promise you, do that. Anything else on the,
Yeah. And the same holds true at the sort of more, if you will, intellectual level, the level of the argument itself. I'll give you a horror story happened to a friend of mine, and it was quite notable in Canada. Some of the Canadians here, particularly, I know that we have some people in Montreal. You may remember this. A friend of mine, very good journalist, actually, really outstanding, Andrew Potter, wrote an article for Maclean's magazine coming back from Mexico. One point from Christmas holidays or somewhere in the South, they landed in the middle of a in the middle of a blizzard in Montreal, and the highway in from the airport had not been cleared. And so, you know, they're exhausted, kids are tired, and he sort of put two and two together, knew that he had a column to write for Maclean's, put two and two together and came up sort of with five, and said, you know, the fact that we can't even clear the highways 5 hours into a blizzard is emblematic of the corrupt public service culture in Quebec. And it's the same thing I'm not sure this was exactly the story, but I remember reading it and thinking, wow, you're sort of taking a bit of a leap here into corruption that we're looking at in Quebec in the construction industry, and why the highway wasn't cleared, right? But he sort of got into a column about corruption based on his experience on the highway. And he filed it, and he told me later, as soon as I did that, I realized you know, the argument didn't hang together. It wasn't logical. He should have been more conservative about it, and it blew back on him in a pretty terrible way. So, you know, this speaks a little bit to, I see one of the questions here is highly polarized environment. How do I take on anti-vaxxers? I'm afraid for myself, for my family, and so on. So first, I would say safety first, right? As much as I think that, you know, democracy dies in darkness and we have to be courageous about the public discussion and all of that, I'm not sure that any article is worth putting anyone at risk if you're seriously at risk. So I just put that there, and Seema may feel differently. But the other thing is to make sure that whatever you write actually hangs together on its own merits. Be conservative about that. Don't make the leap that sort of feels like it's right. Be conservative about the argument you made. So that's part of your fact check too. Take a big step back. So really, are anti-vaxxers all, you know, voting this way? Are anti-vaxxers all ignorant about it? I don't know if they are. Actually, there's some evidence to suggest anti-vaxxers know a ton. A lot of anti-vaxxers know a ton about science.
That's actually the nuance and the counterintuitive thing that would make for a great piece is, hey, did you know that there are some anti-vaxxers who have DRPHs from Harvard? I know some, you know, like, so that makes, actually, it dispels the myth that anti-vaxxers are a monolith, which is the easy route to jump to, Yeah.
So anyway,
what happened with that story, by the way?
It's all, you know, it all played out in public, so I'll just say it. Yeah, no, so it ran in Maclean's. It was filed over the holidays, so a more junior editor was there. Andrew told me later that he realized as soon as he filed it, he shouldn't have, and called up the magazine and said, don't run this. But the junior editor who was on duty that night had already pressed the button and it was out.
Oh, no.
And because things are very polarized in Quebec around certain topics, this had big blowback at McGill, where he had a teaching position, actually. And so anyway, I won't go into all the details, but it blew back on Maclean's, it blew back on McGill, and we were all sort of shaking our heads, you know, and no one less than Andrew, who's actually a genuinely great journalist and reporter, but did what we all are susceptible to doing, right? Jumping on something because it makes sense in the moment, and then, right? So if anyone knows him or was part of this, please do not hear from this that I think he did, like, I personally think he got worse than he deserved, much worse than he deserved, and that we all make mistakes, but it was just a really good little warning.
So that's like thinking about intellectual argument fact checking versus some of the stuff that I was talking about. So to me, the best way to mitigate that is to have a conversation with an editor. Unfortunately, we just heard an example of where that can kind of fall short. Do you have any other advice of how we make sure what we so passionately believe and are spending and putting down like really stands up intellectually?
Yep. Bounce it off someone who you're close to, but who doesn't necessarily agree. If you happen to have a life partner, those are usually awesome people who you're very close to and values your intellect, but who doesn't necessarily agree with everything you say. Sister, brother, colleague, kid, bounce it off them, and then force yourself to defend it and see where the holes are, and be comfortable with holes being poked through, right?
And the key is that they disagree with you, but that they are agreeing with how you're outlining and backing up the argument, right? Which is why that can make them a really useful person to assess. And ideally you also get an editor who kind of like makes sure that your argument stands up. So we have 8 minutes left. Thank you for the
tons of great ideas here
and feedback. So many good ideas. I hope that this has given you a bit more of a scaffold onto which to hang your ideas, so that you feel like you have next steps that you know what to do in order to make your idea actually into an op-ed, one that we can read. Rob's checking to see if there are any more questions we can quickly answer in the next 7 minutes. I just want to say thank you for your time, and please get in touch with us if you end up publishing something. So we'd love to see that. And like I said at the beginning, we're doing this because we really believe in the importance of people like you being able to get your information out there, get your perspectives out there. So Rob, on that note, we have like 7 minutes. That anything you think that is a burning question that we should really get to?
There's tons of really good stuff here.
So can I just quickly say there's a great point from Niranjan, which is about, yes, it's beyond publishing the op-ed. How do you measure the impact of sharing your thoughts? I think we go into journalism, especially as careers, because we want to change the world and make it better. It's hard to measure impact. Sometimes one way of looking at it is like the gold star of the Pulitzer Prizes is the public service one. And often that's because you report on corruption and someone gets fired. You report on a poor policy and the policy gets changed. But it's not always it's not always possible to measure that. And I think it can sometimes be demoralizing if you're like, oh, I'm writing all this stuff and nothing is changing. But do you have a thought about impact, Rob?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of burden to put on any publisher, any individual journalist to change the system. That's actually not our work. And in fact, to the degree that funders have started to get into the media game, and sometimes because they're sort of social enterprise philanthropists, they like to measure by outcome and they want the outcome to be changed. There's been a bit of pushback among journalists. Now, this is among reporters, not opinion writers, who say, like, that puts us in a conflict of interest. We're not here to actually advocate for change. We're here to report. Now, this is different. This is an opinion piece. These are opinion pieces. Let's just be clear that, and I'll just accept that society does not ever really change on the merits of one or two stories. And to be honest, I mean, there are a few things we could point to. We've done stuff in our program, and we could point to a few things where, a story has the Pentagon Papers and so on, but it's rare, and usually it's because there's a lot of stuff going on.
It is rare, but I'm thinking about sometimes a story that might lead to someone's exoneration. Even then, it's rarely one story. It's like a series of stories by the same reporter.
And the point that I would make, and this is not to discourage anyone from writing opinion pieces, but usually the stuff that has the impact, the stuff in this book and the Pulitzer's Gold Book, right? So these are the gold prizes from the Pulitzer organization. Those are reported pieces. That's usually because someone did a ton of investigation, they found facts that no one else saw, and then presented them in a way that was equally accessible to people in all parts of the political spectrum. Even if they don't all agree with it, they can't deny that these facts are there. We're doing something slightly different here. So your impact is more like when you write, and it's just something to accept. Seema sort of alluded to it earlier. When you're writing an argument, you will more likely mobilize the people who already agree with you than convert a lot of people who don't agree with you. But what you can do with the people who do agree with you, and this may be the way to assess impact, is that you may have been able to articulate an argument that has been somewhat shapeless up until that point. You've given voice to an argument, to a perspective that has just either been sort of a rage, an anger, or something simmering and unspoken. And now it's out there. And so I think, and this is not unimportant. Actually, I think this is very important. You are validating a perspective that exists that may not have been spoken. It is more likely that you'll be doing that in the community of which you are a part, or the quiet folks who don't realize you're doing something. Cass Sunstein, professor at Harvard in law, talks about normalizing outlying behaviors, right? That's one of the things that journalism does. You write, that you think this way, and you're coming from this community, and I'm here and I'm putting up my hand and I'm saying I'm thinking this way. A whole bunch of other people who are afraid to think that way now feel comfortable coming out of the shadows. That is more likely to be the impact of an opinion piece than converting a bunch of people who are on the opposite side. But that is a very important impact. It's how Obama won the Democratic nomination. He went into parts of the United States where people thought there are no other Democrats here. I'm the only one. And then it made people realize, no, there are a lot of Democrats in this county. Anyway, sorry, Seema.
Yeah, it's just thinking about like the cornerstone, or one of the cornerstones of like journalistic theory, and thinking about the circles of consensus and how we actually move things from the outside into that is by reporting on it. And maybe to end with something a little bit provocative in the last 2 minutes, is that there are some vaccine scientists who do a lot of media stuff, writing op-eds in the New York Times and other places, who've already received death threats for their work on vaccines from the anti-vaccine groups, but now are deciding, well, that's already happened, like screw the safety part, that's a decision they've made, and are now writing op-eds for right-wing news sites because they're like, I need to get my information to the people who are really misinformed at this point. So not saying that will be the right thing for you, but something to consider, that certainly some folks are like, this ain't gonna change unless I do something drastic. And what they feel is the right thing to do is, instead of just writing op-eds for the New York Times, they're now writing op-eds for the right-wing sites. So
interesting.
Thinking about ways to have impact and measure impact and have influence. Yeah, they're trying that approach now.
Yeah. It's a little bit, one of the questions here, we're just in our last minute or two, came from Stillwater, Oklahoma. Question was, and it's related to this, more around the fact that people in that community, apparently, one of the lowest levels of education in the United States is, as I understand from the chat. This one I'd want to fact check, but it sounds like, certainly it's a an area that according to to our participant is not really well positioned to hear the news on public health mitigation measures and so on. So how do we actually speak to them? Similar kind of thing. And it's probably something that you already do, which is understand, take the time to listen before you write, to understand, maybe it's from the ministers and the clergy in the community, whoever sort of has a good sense of the values in that community, understand what they do find important and what their blocks are on this thing, and then speak to and around that in a way that accepts it, that understands it, that shows compassion and empathy for it, and says, nonetheless, this is stuff that has to fit into there, right? Sorry, by saying this, I want to fact check. I did not mean to be skeptical at all about what you were saying. I was just using that as a light example of fact checking. But so it speaks to that. The more compassionate, empathetic you can be, the more I think you probably mitigate the risk of the kind of violent blowback that you're going to face. But I say this from the comfortable surroundings of a less polarized city than many of our attendees are living in right now.
Yeah. Well, we want to be respectful of your time
Absolutely.
and allow you to leave on time, but thank you so much for engaging with us. We loved your questions and participation. And we hope that this is really useful and that you can use it literally, this afternoon or tomorrow to turn those ideas into published op-eds. Like I said, please get in touch with us if you do publish something. We would love to see it and love to share it.
And if you're interested in the Fellowship of Global Journalism or the Certificate in Health Impact, I'm just going to put this into the Q&A. Fellowship in Global Journalism at the Della Lana School of Public Health in the University of Toronto.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Rob, and thank you to the CME team at Stanford who worked very hard behind the scenes to make this happen.
Yep.
Take care, everyone. Be safe, and please get in touch if you publish something.
Thanks, Seema. Thank you, Stanford.
Bye.